Welcome back, restless minds, to another peculiar journey into the forgotten corners of history here on at Hollow Midnight. If you find yourself stirring in the quiet hours, perhaps contemplating the utterly mundane yet oddly significant roles that once shaped the grand tapestry of human existence, then you've certainly found your dimly lit path. Should these whispered tales offer a gentle nudge away from the humdrum anxieties of your present waking state, consider subscribing, won't you? It helps us continue illuminating these delightfully obscure footnotes of the past. Today, we delve into Chapter 1, the origins of the royal candle snuffer. Imagine, if you will, the deep, impenetrable heart of a medieval castle as dusk descends. The grand halls, hewn from rough stone, once vibrant with the clamor of day, begin to surrender to the encroaching gloom. The vastness of the space, the echoing chill, the very air itself seems to thicken with the coming night. It is in this profound darkness that light becomes not merely a convenience, but a desperate, vital necessity, a fragile bulwark against the terrifying unknown of the shadows. And where there is light, particularly in such abundance as demanded by royalty, there is also the very real, ever-present specter of fire. Not the controlled, comforting flicker of a modern hearth, but the untamed, ravenous beast that lurked in every unattended flame, poised to devour the very fabric of the castle and its inhabitants. In those distant days, centuries before the advent of electricity or even gaslight, the primary source of artificial illumination was the candle. Not the neatly packaged, self-consuming wonders we know today, but crude, often malodorous affairs, painstakingly crafted and yet frustratingly imperfect. For the vast majority, these were tallow candles, rendered from animal fat, often reeking faintly of the beast from which they originated, sputtering and dripping with an alarming frequency. Even the beeswax candles reserved for the wealthiest nobility and the most sacred of spaces, while burning brighter and with less offensive fumes, were still far from pristine. Both varieties shared a common critical flaw: their wicks. These were typically made from loosely braided cotton or hemp, and unlike their modern counterparts, they did not neatly consume themselves as the candle burned down. Instead, as the flame progressed, the wick would char and lengthen, forming a carbonized mushroom at its tip. This mushroom, or snuff, as it was known, would gradually dim the flame, causing it to smoke excessively, coating surfaces in a fine, greasy layer of soot. More dangerously still, these glowing snuffs, heavy with carbon, had an unnerving tendency to break off and fall. Picture, if you will, a tiny incandescent ember detaching itself from a flickering wick, plummeting silently onto a priceless tapestry woven with threads of wool and silk, onto a floor strewn with rushes and straw, or worse, onto a king's silken bedsheets. The potential for catastrophe was not merely theoretical. It was an everyday, tangible threat. A medieval castle, for all its imposing stone walls and formidable defenses, was at its heart a highly flammable structure. Timber beams formed ceilings and floors, intricate wooden carvings adorned walls, and heavy tapestries, rich with dyes and oils, hung from every available surface, designed to ward off the perpetual damp and chill, but also serving as ideal fuel. Libraries were filled with vellum and parchment, kitchens hummed with open flames, and sleeping chambers were often filled with straw mattresses. The constant interplay of thousands of candles, each one a tiny, uncontrolled bonfire, with these highly combustible materials, created an environment of perpetual, low-level anxiety. A diligent guard, a quick-thinking servant, could often avert disaster, but the sheer volume of flames scattered throughout labyrinthine corridors and countless chambers made total vigilance an impossible dream. One spark, one forgotten ember, and the entire edifice, a testament to centuries of power and prestige, could be reduced to smoldering ruin in a single terrifying night. The very air, thick with the smell of wood smoke and old tallow, was a constant reminder of the ever-present danger. In the nascent stages of these flickering civilizations, the duty of managing these problematic illuminators likely fell to any available servant. A chamberlain might trim the candles in the king's private study, a kitchen boy might pinch the wicks in the scullery, a lady-in-waiting might tend to the flames in her mistress' bedchamber. But as courts grew more elaborate, as the royal households expanded, and as the demand for constant, reliable light intensified, the sheer number of candles required to illuminate a sprawling palace became staggering. Imagine hundreds, perhaps thousands, of candles needing constant attention, day and night, throughout the various wings, guard posts, servants' quarters, and ceremonial halls. This was no longer a task that could be haphazardly distributed among a general retinue. It demanded a focused, methodical, and almost ceaseless effort. The dimming of a flame meant not just inconvenience, but often a disruption to royal business, a loss of security, or even a symbolic decline in the monarch's grandeur. The excessive smoke irritated eyes and lungs, staining priceless frescoes and tapestries. It was out of this very pragmatic, very constant demand for efficient light and, more importantly, fire prevention, that the specialized role of the royal candle snuffer slowly, almost imperceptibly, emerged from the murky depths of medieval court bureaucracy. It wasn't a role born of glamour or prestige. No royal decree was likely ever issued proclaiming the glorious establishment of the grand snuffer of the royal wick. Instead, it was a position forged in the smoke and shadows, a testament to the persistent, mundane realities of pre-industrial life. The earliest snuffers were likely just ordinary servants, perhaps those with a steady hand and a tolerance for repetitive, unglamorous work, who found themselves increasingly dedicated solely to the delicate art of maintaining the castle's myriad flames. They moved through the castle's nocturnal rhythms, a silent, almost spectral presence, their footsteps muffled by the thick straw, and their faces often smudged with soot, armed with a very specific and increasingly refined tool. These tools, the very instruments that defined their obscure profession, were more than just simple scissors. Early versions might have been crude tongs or even just fingers, though the latter was perilous and often resulted in burns and smeared wax. But necessity, as ever, was the mother of invention, and soon specialized candle snuffers began to appear. These were scissor-like implements, often made of iron or brass, with broad blades designed to pinch the wick, and crucially, a small cup-like receptacle attached to one blade. This clever addition was designed to catch the hot, smoldering snuff as it was trimmed, preventing the dangerous glowing ember from falling onto combustible surfaces below. Some, destined for royal use, might even be elegantly crafted, perhaps with ornate handles, a testament not to the snuffer's status, but to the importance of the task itself. They were the unsung heroes of passive fire suppression, wielding their unique tools with a practiced, almost surgical precision. The life of a royal candle snuffer, therefore, was one defined by long hours, repetitive motions, and a profound, almost philosophical intimacy with the flickering edge of danger. Their day, or rather their night, often began when the court was settling down. As the last rays of twilight faded and the castle plunged into darkness, save for the nascent glow of newly lit candles, the snuffer would begin their rounds. They would traverse endless corridors, ascend winding staircases, and navigate sprawling chambers, a silent observer in a world that rarely observed them in return. Their senses would become attuned to the subtle shifts in a flame's demeanor, the telltale darkening of a wick, the sudden plume of smoke, the telltale drip of wax that signaled an inefficient burn, the rhythmic eclick of their specialized shears as they deftly pinched off a glowing snuff would be the only sound accompanying their passage, a monotonous symphony of fire prevention. Imagine the sheer physical demands, the hours spent on their feet, the constant vigilance, the occasional scald from dripping wax. the enduring smell of tallow and beeswax and burnt wick that would cling to their clothes and hair like an unfortunate perfume. Socially, the Snuffer occupied a peculiar, almost invisible position. They were indispensable, a living, breathing safety mechanism, without whom the king's very palace might well succumb to an uncontrolled blaze. Yet, they were rarely seen in daylight, and when they were, it was as a shadowy figure, unremarkable in the grand tapestry of courtly life. No one paid attention to the Snuffer until a room went dark, or, far worse, until the ominous scent of smoke filled the air, signaling a failure in their quiet, relentless duty. They were privy to all the courts, nocturnal secrets, whispered conversations, clandestine meetings, illicit rendezvous simply, by virtue of being present, moving through the shadows, yet entirely unregarded, their perceived lowliness acting as the perfect cloak of invisibility. Their importance, however, cannot be overstated. In a world where light equated to safety, productivity, and even the very display of power, the Snuffer ensured that the king could read his dispatches, the queen could mend her embroidery, the courtiers could play their games of chance, and the guards could see who approached the castle walls. Without the constant, diligent work of these overlooked individuals, the very foundations of medieval courtly life, so utterly dependent on the precarious glow of thousands of candles, would have been perpetually threatened by the most ancient and destructive of forces. The origins of the royal candle Snuffer, therefore, are not found in some grand decree or noble lineage, but in the most fundamental and unchanging human need, the desire for light and the desperate, tireless fight against the darkness and the dangers it so often concealed. Their story is a quiet, smoky testament to the myriad, unglamorous roles that were absolutely essential to the functioning of an age long past, a world brought to light, literally by their humble, tireless efforts. Chapter 2. A day in the life of a candle Snuffer. The earliest stirrings of the castle were not the clang of blacksmiths or the distant bleating of sheep from the outer bailey, but the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the quality of the darkness. For Thomas, the senior royal candle Snuffer, it was the moment when the deepest black began to yield to a thin charcoal gray beyond the narrow slit of his quarters, a sliver of light promising the sun. His mornings did not begin with the sun, however, but long before it, when the last remnants of the night's reverie still clung to the great hall and the sleeping chambers of the royal family. A Snuffer's dawn was the extinguishing of night's artificial glow. He rose from his straw pallet, the familiar ache in his lower back a constant companion, a ghost of countless hours spent bending, reaching, and standing. The air in his small, windowless room, tucked deep within the castle's service corridors, was perpetually cool and held the faint, lingering scent of extinguished wick and old beeswax, a perfume of his profession. He donned his practical homespun tunic, its fabric thick and unadorned, designed for function and invisibility rather than display. From a small hook he retrieved his tools, the polished brass Snuffer with its clever cup-like jaw, meticulously cleaned the night before, and a small, pointed iron pick for clearing stubborn carbon from wick holders. He checked the wick of his own small, personal tallow candle, a necessary companion in the still dark labyrinth of corridors, trimming it quickly before lighting it with a well-worn flint and steel. The tiny flame cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn stone walls as he stepped out into the pre-dawn quiet. His first rounds were a methodical dance with the dying light. He moved through the outer corridors first, where the cheaper tallow candles, lit by guards and junior staff throughout the night, were sputtering their last. Here, the extinguishing was pragmatic, a quick pinch, the small sizzle of the flame being starved of oxygen, and the brief, pungent cloud of smoke. Head checked the wax pools, ensuring no errant drips threatened the timber or the straw-strewn floors. Each extinguished flame meant one less potential hazard, one less carbon footprint on the castle's ancient stone. He would gather the nearly consumed stubs, tossing them into a heavy bucket he carried, which would later be sorted for rendering or disposal. It was a process repeated hundreds of times across the castle's periphery. The guard posts, the servants' stairwells, the cold kitchens where the first cooks were beginning to stir, grumbling softly as they prepared for the day's immense task of feeding the royal household. As the gray light outside gradually strengthened, filtering weakly through high arrow slits, Thomas would begin his ascent to the more distinguished sections of the castle. The shift in candle quality was immediate. Here, in the main audience chambers, the royal library, and the Queen's private withdrawing rooms, only beeswax candles were used. These burned cleaner, brighter, and with a sweeter, more refined scent, though they still produced the problematic mushroom wick. It was in these areas that the ceremonial flair became apparent. Not out of grand dictate, but from an unspoken understanding of royal aesthetics and efficiency. Imagine Thomas entering the great hall. The vast chamber, still heavy with the ghosts of last night's feast and political machinations, was dotted with hundreds of candles, many still burning bright, their wicks now elongated and smoking. He would approach each candelabra, each wall sconce, each freestanding candle holder with a quiet reverence. There was no hurried rush here. First, a slight bow, a gesture of respect not necessarily for the flame itself, but for the royal presence it represented, or had so recently illuminated. Then, the careful positioning of his hand and tool, ensuring the brass cup was perfectly aligned beneath the wick. The pinch itself was swift and decisive, a clean snap, no lingering smoke, no wax flung astray. The glowing snuff was trapped instantly within the cup, held until it cooled to a harmless ash. This wasn't merely putting out a flame. It was a performance of precision, a quiet ballet of termination. The action was repeated for every single flame, sometimes 200 or more in the great hall alone, each extinguished with the same measured grace. The process was slow, meditative even, each click of the snuffer a tiny period marking the end of the night and the gentle invitation of the new day. His route would take him through the royal antechambers, where courtiers might soon be gathering, their whispered anxieties echoing in the stone. He'd move into the private studies where scrolls lay open on tables, awaiting the return of a sleepy scribe or a pondering lord. He observed the remnants of their night's work, a forgotten quill, a spilled inkpot, a half-eaten piece of bread. He saw it all, yet was seen by none. The snuffer became part of the background, a moving shadow in the liminal space between night and day, privy to the quiet secrets left behind by the privileged. The flicker of a still-burning candle by a discarded letter often held more intrigue for him than any court gossip. His was a life of observation, without participation, a silent witness to the ebb and flow of courtly existence. By mid-morning, as the castle fully awoke, and the clamor of daily life swelled, Thomas' extinguishing rounds would be complete. The castle, save for perhaps a few necessary flames in the kitchens or workshops, would be largely unlit by artificial means, basking in the natural light that streamed through its narrow windows. This was his brief respite, though hardly a true rest. He would return to his small storeroom, emptying the bucket of candle stubs, sorting them, and then, with meticulous care, cleaning and polishing his tools. The brass of his snuffer had to gleam, its mechanism smooth and unimpeded. Any build-up of carbon or wax could compromise its efficiency, and inefficiency in the snuffer's world meant potential disaster. He would also inspect the candle stores, checking inventory, sorting new shipments from the candle maker, and ensuring enough of the precious beeswax and common tallow was on hand for the coming night. This was the unseen logistical backbone of his role, a mundane yet critical task that ensured the continued illumination of the kingdom's heart. The afternoon brought a shift in duties. While most court roles were active during the day, the snuffer's prime time was the twilight hours. Yet, throughout the day, candles were still lit for various purposes. A hurried meeting in a shadowed corner of the council chambers, a royal physician examining a patient in a dim room, or the preparation of a private supper for a high-ranking guest. Thomas was on call, a silent sentinel, ready to trim a wick, clear a smoky flame, or extinguish a candle deemed no longer necessary. He would patrol, moving from chamber to chamber, occasionally encountering a bewildered new page, struggling with a smoking wick, or a courtier complaining about the smell of soot. He would approach quietly, offer a swift, practiced hand, and the problem would be solved without a word, the snuffer fading back into the shadows from which he appeared. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then, his replies were terse, focused on the immediate task. As evening approached, the cycle began to reverse. This was the lighting phase, though Thomas himself was not primarily a lighter of candles. That duty often fell to younger pages, or less experienced servants. His role was maintenance. As thousands of new flames flickered to life across the vast castle, transforming its cold stone into a warm, inviting glow, Thomas would begin his active rounds again, but this time he was trimming, not extinguishing. He'd follow in the wake of the lighters, observing the newly lit wicks, identifying those that were burning unevenly, those that already began to mushroom as they quickly consumed the wax. The sheer volume of new wicks meant constant, almost frantic work. He moved with a practiced fluidity, his hands working almost independently of his mind, pinching, clearing, ensuring each flame burned at its optimal brightness, minimizing smoke, and maximizing safety. The peak of his day, or rather his night, was during the grand evening gatherings. Feasts, balls, audiences with foreign dignitaries. These events demanded perfect illumination. The great hall would be ablaze with countless candles, reflecting off polished silver and glittering jewels, a dazzling spectacle. And in the midst of this controlled chaos, Thomas would weave, a quiet, almost invisible figure. He moved through the periphery, along the walls, behind tapestries, always with an eye on the flames. A smoking candelabra above the king's table, a sputtering sconce near the queen's dais, a wick nearing its end in a dark alcove were his immediate concerns. He would approach, sometimes having to wait patiently for a gap in conversation or a break in the music, before performing his precise, almost ceremonial trimming. The soft click-click of his snuffer would often be drowned out by the merriment, yet its impact was immediate. A brighter, cleaner flame, less smoke, less risk. He was the unsung curator of the castle's nocturnal radiance. He witnessed all the courtly drama, the whispered intrigues, the subtle power plays, the fleeting glances of forbidden love. He saw the genuine smiles and the forced laughter, the drunken antics and the shrewd negotiations. Yet his gaze was always drawn to the light, to the fragile dance of fire and wax. The faces of the courtiers, illuminated by the very flames he managed, were merely backdrops to the primary actors of his world. The wicks, the wax, the embers, and the ever-present threat of uncontrolled fire. He was a man defined by absence, the absence of smoke, the absence of dropped embers, the absence of panic. His day would conclude long after the last courtier had retired, after the last royal lamp had been extinguished by his hand, after the castle had once again settled into its deep, echoing quiet. Only then would he make a final slow circuit, checking every chamber, every corridor, ensuring no rogue flame, no forgotten ember, remained to haunt the darkness. The work was endless, cyclical, a perpetual battle against the very source of light he was tasked to maintain. He was the guardian of the castle's precious glow, the silent warder against its greatest, most insidious enemy. He was the royal candle snuffer, and his day was a testament to the fact that even in the grandest palaces, the most vital duties were often the most mundane, performed by the most overlooked individuals. Chapter 3. The tools of the trade, the heart of Thomas' world. The very nexus of his quiet power lay not within the grand, echoing halls of the castle, but rather in the cool, contained space of his small workroom, within the carefully arranged tools that hung on their hooks or rested in their designated nooks. These were not the swords of knights, gleaming with heroic luster, nor the intricate jewels of the queen, sparkling with vanity and light. No, Thomas' implements were far more humble, yet in their own way possessed a silent authority over the very light that defined the castle's waking and sleeping hours. His primary companion, the Snuffer itself, was a testament to both ingenious practicality and, in its finest manifestations, a surprising degree of artistry. The one Thomas prized above all others, reserved for the royal chambers and the most public of functions, was crafted from a dark, almost burnished brass, its surface worn smooth by years of constant use. It was scissor-like in form, as most were, but the blades were broad, designed not for cutting but for pinching. One blade, the lower one, terminated in a shallow, perfectly curved cup, a small receptacle that seemed almost to sigh with anticipation. The upper blade, designed to meet its partner with flawless precision, had a matching curve. The handles, too, were more than mere loops for fingers. They were gracefully sculpted, perhaps with a subtle twist or a tiny stylized bird's head at the pivot, testament to a smith who understood that even a humble tool could possess a quiet dignity. The action of closing it was swift, clean, and silent, delivering a crisp clicky that was almost musical to Thomas' trained ear. This particular Snuffer, he knew, had been forged not far from the castle by a craftsman who specialized in such implements. Understanding the subtle balance required for perfect operation, it needed to be heavy enough to feel substantial in the hand, but light enough for endless repetition without fatigue. The tension in the pivot had to be just right, allowing for a smooth, unfaltering pinch. A loose Snuffer meant a dropped ember, a stiff one meant a strained hand. Beyond this refined brass piece, Thomas possessed a collection of other Snuffers, each suited for a specific purpose. There was the heavy, plain iron Snuffer, almost brutish in its simplicity, reserved for the common tallow candles in the guards' barracks and the sculleries. Its cup was larger, designed to catch the often greasy and larger snuffs produced by inferior wicks, and its action was less precise, more of a decisive gee-to-die than a e-clicking. For the grand candelabras that hung from the highest ceilings of the great hall, some 40 feet above the stone floor, he used a Snuffer fixed to a surprisingly light, yet strong oak pole, perhaps 12 feet in length. The mechanism at the end was actuated by a series of thin, almost invisible wires running down the length of the pole, connected to a lever near the base. Operating this required a steady hand and a keen eye, guiding the distant brass cup towards a flickering wick far above. A delicate dance performed in the semi-darkness, often with a young apprentice holding a portable lantern below. But the Snuffer itself was merely the star of the show. The supporting cast of tools was equally vital. Next to his main Snuffer on the hook hung a small, slender iron pick, its tip honed to a fine point. This was for clearing the hardened carbon buildup from the wick holders of sconces, or for gently coaxing a stubborn wick back into its central position. There were also various pairs of tongs, one long and slender for retrieving errant wicks that had fallen into hot wax pools, another with broad flat jaws for carefully lifting a stubbornly burning candle stub from its holder before it melted into an unsightly mess. He had a collection of small curved scrapers resembling miniature hoes for chipping away dried wax from candelabra branches and wall sconces, a task that was as tedious as it was essential for maintaining the castle's grand appearance, for illumination of his own path through the darkest corridors. Particularly during the pre-dawn hours, Thomas carried a small covered lantern, its single tallow flame carefully shielded to prevent accidental drafts from extinguishing it, and for lighting the initial few candles, or for relighting a flame that had been accidentally doused. He carried a small, well-worn leather pouch containing a flint and steel, and a carefully prepared bundle of dry tinder. He was a master of striking a spark in a single fluid motion, a skill that belied the apparent simplicity of the act. Protection, too, came in the form of specialized gear. While the notion of truly fireproof gloves was centuries away, Thomas possessed a pair of thick, elbow-length gauntlets, crafted from the toughest, most supple leather, perhaps even treated with a special oil to make them more resistant to heat and impervious to hot wax drips. They were clumsy, certainly, but they offered a necessary barrier between his skin and the scorching heat of an overzealous flame or a sudden splash of molten wax. He also wore a heavy, dark canvas smock over his tunic, perpetually stained with the ghostly imprints of wax and the fine, almost imperceptible dust of soot. This smock served not only to protect his clothes, but also to give him a uniform appearance, a symbol of his humble yet crucial station. He was, in essence, an extension of his tools, moving through the castle as one with them, a quiet, almost mechanical presence. Maintaining these tools was as much a ritual as using them. Every morning, after his extinguishing rounds were complete, Thomas would retreat to his workroom. The brass snuffer would be meticulously wiped clean of all carbon residue, then polished with a special cloth and a paste he made from ash and a secret ingredient, until it gleamed with a deep, satisfying luster. The iron tools would be oiled to prevent rust. The leather gauntlets would be inspected for tears and periodically re-oiled to maintain their flexibility and protective qualities. Any damage, no matter how small, would be swiftly repaired by his own practiced hand, or, if beyond his skill, sent to the castle smith, who, despite his usual work with massive anvils and blazing furnaces, understood the delicate precision required for the snuffer's implements. The air in Thomas' small room was a constant testament to his work, thick with the subtle scent of beeswax, tallow, scorched cotton, and the faint, metallic tang of his polished tools. It was a smell that clung to him, a constant reminder of his purpose, a perfume of responsibility. And then there were the superstitions. For centuries, fire had been both a gift and a curse, a bringer of warmth and light, but also a terrifying agent of destruction. In a world still largely defined by primal fears and inexplicable occurrences, it was only natural that the management of fire, even in its most domesticated form, would be imbued with a layer of folk belief and unspoken omens. The royal court, despite its veneer of sophistication, was not immune to these deep-seated convictions. It was widely believed that a candle that extinguished itself without cause, or sputtered violently, foretold ill tidings. If a royal candle, particularly one illuminating the king's presence, smoked excessively despite being regularly trimmed, it was whispered to be an omen of sickness or misfortune befalling the monarch. Conversely, a flame that burned steadily, bright and clear, was considered a blessing, a sign of prosperity and divine favor. Thomas, in his silent rounds, was therefore not just a physical laborer, but an unwitting arbiter of these perceived omens. A perfectly trimmed wick, a clean, bright flame, wasn't just good practice. It was, in the minds of some, a subtle act of warding off ill luck. There were specific superstitions related to the snuffer's work itself. To drop a snuffed wick, even a tiny glowing ember, was considered a particularly bad omen, especially if it landed near something significant, a royal garment, an important document, or worse, directly onto the person of a noble. Such an occurrence, though rare for a practiced hand like Thomas, would send a shiver through those who witnessed it, confirming their deepest fears about impending disaster. Thomas himself, though a practical man, could not entirely escape the pervasive influence of these beliefs. He would find himself, almost unconsciously, performing small, silent rituals, a slight tap of the snuffer on his palm before a particularly important room, a whispered apology to the flame as he extinguished it for the night, a careful placement of the collected snuff in his bucket as if to contain not just ash, but also any lingering ill will. Some whispered that the Snuffer, by constantly dealing with the boundary between light and darkness, acquired a certain liminal quality himself. He was the one who plunged rooms into gloom, yet also the one who ensured the light that remained was pure and safe. He was seen as a guardian against fire, a silent protector, but also, in a strange way, as a figure associated with endings, with the snuffing out of life, represented by the flame. Children, particularly the more superstitious ones, would sometimes cross themselves or avert their gaze as Thomas passed, a shadowy figure moving through the castle with his tools, a bringer of quiet darkness and a remover of danger. Thomas found a strange, ironic humor in these superstitions. He knew the truth was far less mystical. A sputtering wick was often just a poorly made one, a dropped snuff, the result of a moment's fatigue. Yet he also understood that the human mind craved order, even in the unpredictable dance of a flame. His meticulousness, his relentless pursuit of perfect illumination and complete fire suppression, therefore served a dual purpose. It ensured the physical safety of the castle and its inhabitants, and it quietly assuaged the anxieties of a world still very much at the mercy of the elements. He was the mundane hand that kept the chaos at bay, both the tangible chaos of fire and the intangible chaos of ill omens. His tools, therefore, were not just instruments of his trade, but symbols of this profound, unspoken compact with the light and the encroaching, ever-present darkness. Chapter 4. The hierarchy of snuffers, even within the quiet, smoke-tinged world of the candle snuffer. A profession defined by its ceaseless monotony and deliberate invisibility, there existed a subtle yet rigid pecking order, a hierarchy as precisely calibrated as the brass jaws of Thomas' own favored snuffer. It was a structure built not on grand titles or noble lineage, but on experience, diligence, and the slow, arduous accumulation of trust. This pecking order determined who extinguished the sputtering tallow in the furthest guard posts, and who meticulously trimmed the beeswax flames, illuminating the very crown of the kingdom. It was a silent, unacknowledged ladder. Yet for those who spent their lives tending to the castle's precarious glow, it was as vital as the stone foundations beneath their feet. At the very bottom of this peculiar pyramid were the apprentices, often mere boys plucked from the castle's teeming ranks of scullery lads or stable hands, boys whose families had perhaps too many mouths to feed, or whose quick, nimble fingers suggested a natural aptitude for the delicate dance with fire. Their initial days were a haze of discomfort and minor burns. They began with the most thankless of tasks, gathering discarded candle stubs from every corner of the vast castle, scrubbing wax from neglected sconces, and endlessly polishing the iron snuffers of their immediate superiors. Their first true interactions with flame were often limited to the dim, malodorous tallow candles in the outer bailey, or the crude, flickering lamps in the servants' deepest tunnels, far from any royal gaze. The wicks of these common candles were notoriously unruly, smoking and dripping with an alarming persistence, requiring frequent attention. An apprentice's fingers would quickly become calloused, and the smell of burnt animal fat would permanently permeate their flimsy tunics. They learned the hard way about the sudden flare of an untrimmed wick, the painful splash of hot wax, and the quiet, almost conspiratorial sizzle of a flame being deprived of its oxygen. Many a boy in those early days was known to drop a glowing snuff onto a pile of straw, only to be met with a swift, stinging cuff to the ear from a supervising journeyman. Fear, not skill, was often their first teacher. Their aspirations, then, were humble: to avoid burning themselves, to not cause a major incident, and eventually to be deemed competent enough to handle a proper snuffer of their own. Above the raw apprentices were the journeyman snuffers. These were the young men who had endured years of smoky tutelage, whose hands had learned the intuitive rhythm of the snuffer, and whose eyes could discern a problematic wick from across a dimly lit chamber. They were given more responsibility, entrusted with patrols through the knight's quarters, the minor courtiers' apartments, and the extensive kitchens. Their tools were better, often plain brass or well-maintained iron, lacking the ornate flourishes of the senior snuffer's instruments, but reliable and efficient. They moved with a newfound confidence, a quiet pride in their growing mastery. A journeyman could often be identified by the subtle absence of hesitation in their movements, the way they approached a candelabra with an almost surgical calm. They were the backbone of the daily operations, responsible for the vast majority of the castle's illumination and extinguishing needs. They knew the labyrinthine corridors like the back of their smoke-stained hands, the subtle creaks of floorboards, the drafts that could make a flame dance erratically, the exact number of steps from the grand staircase to the south tower. Their world was one of endless repetition, broken only by the occasional minor emergency, a forgotten candle, a mysteriously dwindling flame, or the rare, terrifying scent of scorching wood that would send a jolt of ice through their veins. For them, advancement meant securing a position in the more prestigious areas, perhaps the main dining halls or the armory, where beeswax candles offered a cleaner, more pleasant work environment. Thomas, as a senior snuffer, occupied a position of considerable, though still largely unacknowledged, authority. He had long since passed through the trials of apprenticeship and the endless rounds of a journeyman. His duties were focused on the most critical areas of the castle: the royal apartments, the great hall, the council chambers, and the royal library. These were the spaces where discretion was paramount, where a dropped ember could not only cause a fire but also reveal a hidden document or disrupt a sensitive diplomatic discussion. Thomas and his peers possessed the finest tools, often crafted with a subtle elegance, and they wielded them with an almost artistic precision. They were masters of the ceremonial snuffer, ensuring that even the act of extinguishing a flame contributed to the aura of controlled grandeur that defined the royal court. They oversaw small teams of journeymen and apprentices, assigning rounds, inspecting their work, and quietly correcting their inevitable mistakes. They were the eyes and ears of the Snuffer Corps, reporting directly to the master of the royal flame on any significant issues: an unusual number of candles consumed, a faulty batch of wicks, or, God forbid, a near miss with a potential blaze. Their knowledge extended beyond mere mechanics. They understood the properties of different waxes, the effects of humidity on wicks, and the optimal placement of candles for both illumination and safety. They were the living embodiments of accumulated experience, their wisdom gathered through countless nights, spent in silent communion with flickering light. Their reward was not greater wealth or overt recognition, but the subtle respect of their peers, the quiet satisfaction of a job perfectly done, and the occasional, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement from a higher-ranking courtier, who understood, if only dimly, the vital nature of their unseen work. At the very pinnacle of this humble, yet vital, profession resided the master of the royal flame. This was a position rarely held for long, as the stress of perpetual vigilance against disaster, combined with the often thankless nature of the role, could take its toll. The master was less a hands-on snuffer and more of an administrator, a strategist of light and fire prevention for the entire royal household. They were often men of advancing years, their faces etched with the fatigue of countless sleepless nights, their eyes possessing a permanent, distant vigilance. The current master, a taciturn man named Alaric, had held the post for nearly 20 years. His hands, though still capable, were no longer primarily occupied with the rhythmic eye-clicking of the snuffer. Instead, he dealt with logistics, procurement, and policy. He negotiated with the candle makers for the finest beeswax, ensuring a consistent supply of quality candles. He managed the budget for tallow and wick materials. He oversaw the training of new apprentices, though he rarely taught them directly, preferring to observe from a distance, assessing their potential with a single, knowing glance. Alaric's days were spent in meetings with the Lord Chamberlain, discussing the illumination needs for upcoming feasts or diplomatic receptions. He maintained meticulous ledgers detailing candle consumption across different castle sections, identifying areas of unusual usage or potential waste. He was responsible for the strategic placement of emergency water buckets and sand, ensuring that, should a fire indeed break out, the initial response was swift and effective. His greatest challenge was not the extinguishing of flames, but the constant political maneuvering required to secure adequate resources for a department that was only truly appreciated in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, or, conversely, when a room unexpectedly plunged into darkness. He alone bore the ultimate responsibility for any major fire that might erupt within the castle walls. It was a terrifying weight, a constant, unspoken dread that hung over his every waking moment, and undoubtedly crept into his dreams. He rarely spoke of it, but the deep lines around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands, were silent testaments to the burden he carried. For Alaric, the hierarchy wasn't about power, but about the distribution of this crushing responsibility. The interactions within this Snuffer hierarchy were generally quiet, professional, and punctuated by the shared understanding of their collective, yet individual, burden. There were no grand pronouncements or formal ceremonies of promotion. Instead, a journeyman might find himself quietly assigned to a more prestigious area, or an apprentice might finally be given his own, albeit simple, snuffer to wield, both signs of unspoken advancement. Rivalries was subtle, expressed not in open conflict but in the meticulousness of one's work, the speed of one's rounds, the pristine cleanliness of one's tools. A perfectly trimmed wick in a prominent chamber was a silent boast. An efficiently managed section of the castle devoid of smoky trails was a mark of honor. Yet, despite the rigorous hierarchy, there was also a unique camaraderie amongst the snuffers, born from their shared experience. They were, in essence, a brotherhood of shadows, moving through the nocturnal castle, bound by the common goal of preventing disaster. They understood the peculiar smells that clung to their clothes, the persistent ache in their hands, the subtle shifts in the castle's ambient temperature that indicated a draught that could endanger a flame. They knew the unspoken language of flickering light and the subtle signs of a wick about to fail. They would offer quiet tips to one another, a better way to clean a particular type of sconce, a trick for dealing with a stubborn candle holder. They lived in a world apart, separate from the dazzling court above them, their importance acknowledged only in the continued absence of catastrophe. Their promotions and advancements, though rarely celebrated, were felt deeply within their small, self-contained world, a world illuminated by the very flames they diligently, silently, and often thanklessly managed. Chapter 5. The most infamous candle snuffer in history. It is a peculiar twist of fate, is it not, that the very individuals tasked with the tireless prevention of fire in a sprawling medieval castle should occasionally, and in one particular instance, rather spectacularly, be the unwitting catalyst for its sudden, terrifying emergence. For all the meticulous routines, the polished tools, and the ingrained vigilance, human error, like a stubborn wisp of smoke, often finds a way to manifest. Such was the saga of Barnaby, a journeyman snuffer of the minor royal apartments, whose name, for a brief incandescent moment, became synonymous with panic, soot, and the lingering scent of singed velvet. His story, whispered with a certain morbid fascination amongst the snuffer ranks, was a cautionary tale, a dark legend that both terrified and ironically provided a strange sort of gallows humor. Barnaby was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a careless man. He was in fact rather painfully earnest, a gangly youth of 20 with hands that were more accustomed to the delicate pinching of a wick than the heavy lifting required of most castle servants. He had, by dint of sheer persistence and a commendable, if somewhat clumsy diligence, risen from the ranks of the scullery apprentices to become a journeyman, tending to the lesser, but no less numerous, chambers of dukes and visiting dignitaries. His snuffer, a serviceable iron tool, was always clean, and his leather gauntlets, though scarred by countless wax drips, were faithfully worn. Yet Barnaby possessed a certain nervous energy, a tendency to rush when under pressure, a trait that, in the precise, slow-moving world of flame management, could be a dangerous liability. The evening of the incident was a night of unparalleled grandeur. The king was hosting an envoy from a distant, wealthy kingdom, an event designed to impress, to dazzle, and to subtly intimidate. Every available sconce, every candelabra, every freestanding candle holder in the main wing of the castle was ablaze with thousands of the finest beeswax candles. The great hall itself shimmered like a golden sea, reflecting off the polished armor of the royal guard, the glittering jewels of the courtiers, and the vast, intricate tapestries that adorned every wall. The air, usually thick with the faint tang of damp stone, was now sweet with the scent of burning beeswax, mingling with the perfumes of the nobility and the rich aroma of roasted meats emanating from the kitchens. For the snuffers, it was a night of relentless, almost frantic activity. Wicks, burning continuously for hours, lengthened with alarming speed, producing more smoke than usual in the thick, still air of the crowded hall. Barnaby, usually relegated to the less glamorous side chambers, found himself unexpectedly pressed into service in the great hall. A senior snuffer had taken ill, and the master of the royal flame, Alaric, had barked orders for any available journeyman to fill the gap. The sheer scale of the task was overwhelming. Barnaby, a tiny, almost invisible figure, moved through the throng, his eyes darting from flame to flame, his iron snuffer clicking with desperate regularity. The warmth of the room, the press of bodies, the cacophony of music and laughter, all conspired to disorient him. His usual meticulousness began to fray at the edges. It happened near the dais, where the king himself was engaged in animated conversation with the foreign envoy, their voices booming across the hall. A magnificent, deep crimson velvet curtain, embroidered with threads of gold and silver, hung directly behind the king's throne. Below it, on a polished oak stand, sat a massive multi-branched candelabra, its dozens of beeswax candles burning furiously. One particular wick, at the very edge of the candelabra, nearest to the heavy fabric, had developed an unusually long, glowing mushroom of carbon. It smoked heavily, a thin, acrid plume rising towards the valuable tapestry, threatening to stain its priceless fabric. Barnaby, seeing it from a distance, felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. This was precisely the kind of oversight that would draw Alaric's sharp rebuke. He made his way through the jostling crowd, offering mumbled apologies as he navigated past flowing gowns and gleaming ceremonial swords. He reached the candelabra. Bowing slightly, his eyes fixed on the offending flame, he raised his snuffer, his hand trembling slightly from the combination of fatigue and nerves. The wick, as if sensing his approach, chose that precise moment to become particularly recalcitrant. It sputtered, then flared, then released a larger-than-usual puff of smoke. Barnaby, in his haste to extinguish the mushroom before it deposited ash on the king's person, angled his snuffer just a fraction too high. The clicky of the brass jaw was crisp, but instead of cleanly catching the hot carbon, the glowing ember, unexpectedly large and tenacious, detached itself and propelled by a sudden, imperceptible draft, perhaps from a recently opened side door, or merely a localized eddy in the warm air of the crowded hall, flew free. It wasn't a large spark, no bigger than a beetle, but it was intensely, frighteningly incandescent. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Barnaby watched, frozen, as the tiny malevolent star sailed through the air, directly towards the opulent crimson curtain. It landed with an almost imperceptible hiss on a delicate gold embroidery near the bottom of the curtain. For a moment, nothing happened. Barnaby held his breath, praying to every saint he could recall that it would simply cool and fall harmlessly. But the curtain, centuries old, rich with accumulated dust and oils, and perhaps a touch of unfortunate alchemy in its dyes, was a tinderbox disguised as luxury. A wisp of smoke, impossibly thin, curled upward. Then a tiny, almost shy flicker of orange appeared, no larger than a child's fingernail, blossoming from the point of impact. Barnaby's blood ran cold. The king was still speaking, oblivious, his back to the developing catastrophe. The envoy was nodding politely. The music played on. The hall buzzed with oblivious conversation. Only Barnaby, the humble snuffer, the one who saw the world through the precarious dance of flame, witnessed the terrifying genesis. The tiny flame grew, feeding greedily on the dry, rich fabric. It began to climb, a serpent of fire licking its way up the opulent cloth. The initial sweetness of beeswax was quickly overshadowed by the acrid, sickening smell of burning wool and silk. Barnaby stood paralyzed, his snuffer still open in his hand, his mouth agape. His mind screamed, but no sound escaped his lips. Then a quiet cough from a courtier seated nearby. Their eyes drifted to the curtain, then widened. A hand pointed. A gasp. Then another. The music faltered. A single horrified shout pierced the festive din. Fire, chaos, swift and brutal, erupted. The king, startled, spun around to see his grand curtain, his symbol of regal splendor, rapidly transforming into a charred, smoking ruin. The flame was now chest-high, a hungry orange maw consuming the valuable fabric with frightening speed. Panic, raw and primal, swept through the hall. Courtiers screamed, stumbling over each other in a desperate scramble for the exits. Glasses shattered. Servants, momentarily stunned, began to shout for water. The air filled not only with the stench of burning fabric, but with the shrill cries of alarm and the heavy thud of frantic footsteps. Alaric, the master of the royal flame, appeared as if from nowhere, his face a mask of grim determination. He bellowed orders, his voice cutting through the pandemonium. "Buckets, water, sand, to the dais, you fools!" He pointed directly at Barnaby, who was still standing, rooted to the spot, his face ashen, his iron snuffer hanging uselessly by his side. "Barnaby, you idiot, don't just stand there. Help, tear it down!" Barnaby, jolted into action by Alaric's fury, finally moved. He dropped his snuffer, oblivious, and frantically began tearing at the heavy velvet, trying to pull the burning section away from the wall, away from the wooden framework of the throne. His hands were quickly scorched, his fingers blistered by the intense heat, but he barely registered the pain. Other servants, galvanized by Alaric's shouts, rushed forward with buckets of water and sand, throwing them wildly at the climbing flames. The king's guards, swords drawn, formed a protective perimeter around the royal family, who were being hustled unceremoniously towards a private exit. The fire, though contained to the curtain, was fierce. The grand embroidered fabric, once a symbol of wealth, now resembled a furious flickering beast. Water hissed and steamed as it met the flames, sending clouds of choking smoke billowing into the hall. Sand, meant to smother, only partially helped, mixing with the melted wax from the candelabra to create a greasy black sludge on the polished floor. It was a scene of utter humiliating disarray for the royal court. The foreign envoy, eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination, was swiftly escorted away, no doubt leaving with a rather vivid and unflattering impression of the kingdom's fire safety protocols. Miraculously, or perhaps due to the sheer volume of water and sand eventually thrown, the fire was extinguished before it could spread beyond the curtain to the wooden wall paneling or the throne itself. The great hall was left a smoky, sodden, and deeply embarrassed mess. The magnificent crimson velvet was a charred, dripping ruin, a testament to the brief but terrifying power of an uncontrolled flame. Barnaby, his hands blistered, his face streaked with soot and tears, was dragged before Alaric. He expected execution, or at the very least a lifetime in the deepest dungeon. But Alaric, though his eyes burned with frustrated fury, simply stared at the charred remains of the curtain, then back at Barnaby. The master of the royal flame let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound of utter defeat. "Barnaby," he said, his voice strangely flat, "you have achieved what no other snuffer has managed in a century. You have proven, beyond all doubt, that even the one tasked with light can bring forth the deepest darkness." The king, surprisingly, did not order Barnaby's head. Perhaps it was the sheer absurdity of the situation, the EAG candle snuffer starting a fire. The irony was almost too exquisite for immediate punishment. Or perhaps, seeing the genuine terror and raw remorse etched on Barnaby's face, the monarch decided that public humiliation and a lifetime of self-reproach would be punishment enough. Barnaby was not banished from the castle, nor was he stripped of his title. Instead, he was assigned, permanently, to the most remote and least prestigious areas of the castle, the damp, drafty cellars where the root vegetables were stored, the drafty guard towers, and the farthest, coldest sections of the outer walls. His duties were exclusively the cheapest tallow candles, their unruly wicks demanding constant grimy attention. He was given no apprentices, no journeymen to oversee. His prestigious brass snuffer was replaced with the roughest iron, unpolished and utilitarian. His name, Barnaby the Blight, as he became known among the snuffer corps, was whispered with a mixture of pity and dark amusement. He had lived to tell the tale, certainly, but his story was less a glorious survival and more a perpetual living penance. Every sputtering wick, every wavering flame, every wisp of smoke was a reminder of the night he almost brought the castle to its knees. The incident, however, did lead to some changes. New, more stringent rules were issued regarding the proximity of candles to textiles. More water buckets were placed strategically throughout the castle, and every snuffer, from the lowest apprentice to the master of the royal flame himself, thereafter approached every wick, every flame, with a renewed, almost obsessive caution, a silent prayer that they would never join the infamous ranks of Barnaby, the unwitting arsonist of the royal curtain, the most infamous candle snuffer in all of history. His legacy was the paradox he created, the man of darkness who, for one terrifying moment, brought forth too much light. Chapter 6. The art of subtle extinguishing of all the myriad duties that fell to a royal candle snuffer, from the grand, bustling halls of a royal feast to the drafty, echoing guard posts. None demanded such exquisite precision, such an almost supernatural degree of stealth, as the quiet art of extinguishing flames within the royal family's sleeping chambers. This was not merely a task of maintenance. It was a delicate ballet performed on the knife edge of invisibility, a silent prayer against the dreaded possibility of disturbing the king's slumber, or worse still, interrupting a clandestine meeting of utmost strategic importance. In this particular realm of the snuffer's world, time was fluid, noise was anathema, and the very air seemed to hum with the unspoken imperative of absolute discretion. Imagine the deep, post-midnight quiet that descends upon the private wing of the castle. The sounds of the day have long since faded. The distant clang of the smithy, the murmur of the court, the clatter of kitchen pots. Now, only the persistent subtle creaks of ancient timber and stone, the occasional rustle of a mouse in the wainscoting, or the soft, rhythmic breathing of a sleeping monarch break the profound silence. For a senior snuffer like Thomas, this was his domain, his most challenging stage. He moved not with practiced efficiency, but with a deliberate, almost glacial slowness. Each footfall was considered, each breath measured. His heavy leather boots, which clacked so reassuringly on the flagstones of the outer corridors, were now transformed into instruments of silence, their soles barely brushing the rush-strewn floors of the royal antechambers. The approach to the king's bedchamber was a ritual in itself. First, a pause at the end of the long corridor, listening, not just for obvious sounds, but for the subtle quality of the silence within the chamber. Was there a faint, irregular cough, a restless turning, a sudden stifled whisper that would signal a private conversation still ongoing? These were the signs Thomas learned to interpret, clues that dictated his entry, or, more often, his quiet retreat and patient waiting. He carried his finest brass snuffer, meticulously polished, its mechanism oiled to perfection, ensuring not the slightest creak or grating sound when its jaws met. He would also carry a small, dim lantern, its flame almost entirely occluded by a heavy, dark shroud, allowing only the faintest sliver of light to illuminate his immediate path, just enough to prevent him from tripping over a forgotten stool or a discarded slipper. The last thing one wanted was to make an entrance like a drunken ogre. Upon entering a royal chamber, the first challenge was the very air itself. These rooms, designed for comfort and privacy, were often sealed against drafts, making the air thick and still. This meant that any smoke from a newly extinguished wick would linger, rather than dissipating quickly. A sudden plume of acrid smoke in the royal bedchamber was almost as unforgivable as a loud noise. To combat this, Thomas would often perform a rapid, almost imperceptible flick of his wrist as he pinched the wick, a technique learned over decades, designed to minimize the resulting puff of smoke and trap it instantly within the snuffer's cup before it could rise to offend noble nostrils. The action itself was a single fluid movement. Approach the candle, position the snuffer, clicking. Withdraw. No lingering, no second attempts. The placement of the candles themselves added another layer of complexity. They were rarely at a convenient height. Some might be on low bedside tables, requiring a deep, silent crouch. Others might be on tall, slender stands, demanding a slow, extended reach. Most perilous were those placed on mantelpieces or above doors, near heavy tapestries or velvet drapes, a constant, chilling reminder of Barnaby and his infamous incident. Here, the snuffer had to be acutely aware of the proximity of flammable materials, ensuring that even the residual heat from the extinguished wick did not pose a threat. The royal bedchambers often featured numerous small, intimate lights, a candle by a book, another by a writing desk, one flickering softly by a prayer kneel, 1,000 tiny points of light, each requiring individual silent attention. Thomas' senses, honed by years of nocturnal rounds, became extraordinarily acute in these moments. His ears, trained to pick up the faintest sounds, would register the soft scratch of a moth against a window pane, the distant hoot of an owl from the castle walls, or the gentle sigh of a sleeping nose. His nose would discern the subtle shift in the air, from the sweet scent of beeswax to the faint metallic tang of an overworked wick. His eyes, accustomed to the dimmest light, would instantly identify the telltale mushroom on a wick, even if the flame itself was low and guttering. He saw the world in gradients of light and shadow, perceiving nuances that escaped the notice of those who lived their lives in the glare of day. The most challenging scenario, perhaps, was when the king or queen was not yet asleep, but merely resting, or engaged in quiet contemplation. The snuffer had to discern, without being seen, whether their presence would be an unwelcome intrusion. Sometimes, a noble might be reading by candlelight, lost in a book. Thomas would wait, a silent statue in the doorway, until the book was finally closed, the eyes fluttered shut. Only then would he advance, like a ghost, to gently extinguish the flame. It was a skill that demanded not just physical dexterity, but a profound understanding of human behavior, of the rhythms of sleep and wakefulness, of the subtle cues that announced a shift in a person's state of awareness. The timing had to be impeccable. A single wrong move could shatter the fragile peace of the royal chamber, inviting a sharp rebuke, or worse, a demand for explanation that Thomas, a man of few words, would struggle to provide. There were unspoken rules, too, beyond just quietude. A snuffer never made eye contact if a royal awoke. They would simply perform their duty with a slight deferential bow of the head, then retreat silently. No explanations, no apologies, no lingering. The act itself was meant to be invisible, as if the light simply faded by magic, rather than by the deliberate action of a humble servant. This cultivated anonymity was a shield, protecting the snuffer from both recognition and censure. To be noticed was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny in the world of the snuffer rarely led to anything good. One particular memory often resurfaced for Thomas, a testament to the absolute necessity of this subtle art. He had been extinguishing candles in the Queen's private sitting room late one night. She had been distraught, weeping quietly by the dying embers of the fireplace, a letter crumpled in her hand. Thomas, entering as silently as a breath, saw her, but she did not see him. He paused, uncertain. To extinguish the candles would be to plunge her into absolute darkness at a moment of profound sadness. To leave them would violate his duty and potentially risk fire. He made a choice. He approached only the candles furthest from her, extinguishing them with his usual silent precision, creating a softer, more intimate pool of light around her, without entirely plunging the room into gloom. He left one small, guttering candle by her side, a silent vigil. He then retreated, as unobserved as he had entered. The next morning the master of the royal flame, Alaric, had merely grunted when he saw the remaining candle. He said nothing, but Thomas knew his subtle act of compassion, rather than strict adherence to protocol, had been seen and implicitly understood. It was a rare moment where the human element intersected with the mechanical duty, a silent acknowledgement of the delicate balance between function and empathy. The extinguishing of the last flame in the royal chambers marked the true end of the night for Thomas. As he walked away, the profound darkness behind him was not an emptiness, but a quiet triumph. It was the absence of danger, the assurance of safety, the undisturbed peace of those who ruled. His ears would ring with the phantom eclixy of his snuffer. His nose would still detect the faint scent of spent wick, but his mind would hold the quiet satisfaction of a task perfectly executed, a testament to the art of subtle extinguishing. He was the shadow that brought the night, the quiet hand that cradled the light, and the unseen guardian of the castle's most precious commodity, undisturbed sleep, and the delicate secrets held within its perpetually flickering heart. His was a boring job, perhaps, but one steeped in unseen significance, a whispered necessity in the grand slumbering halls of power. Chapter 7. Candle Snuffers and Court Intrigue. It is a curious paradox of grand palaces and the intricate dance of royal courts that the very individuals entrusted with the most vital, yet utterly unglamorous tasks often found themselves privy to the most sensitive secrets. The royal candle snuffer, that silent, omnipresent shadow, moving through the castle's corridors at all hours, was a prime example of this peculiar phenomenon. Unseen, unhört. And largely unregarded, the snuffer became an accidental repository of whispered betrayals, clandestine liaisons, and political maneuverings, simply by virtue of being there, tending to the flickering edge of illumination. Their perceived lowliness was, in effect, their perfect cloak of invisibility. No one truly saw the snuffer. They saw only the light, or its absence. Imagine, if you will, the private study of a powerful duke, deep in the twilight hours. The air is thick with the scent of aged parchment and stale wine. Two figures, their faces cast in dramatic chiaroscuro by the dozen beeswax candles on the grand oak table, lean close, their voices hushed. Conspiratorial. One, perhaps, is a scheming count, gesturing wildly with a jeweled ring, outlining a treacherous plot against a rival. The other, a nervous baron, listens, occasionally nodding, his eyes darting towards the door, though never towards the shadowed corners. In the background, a snuffer, perhaps Thomas himself or one of his senior journeymen, approaches the candelabra with painstaking slowness, his movements exaggeratedly deliberate, his gaze fixed with an almost unnatural intensity on a sputtering wick. His brass snuffer clicks softly, once, twice, as he meticulously trims and clears the carbonized remnants. The sound is barely perceptible, a mere insect's whisper against the backdrop of hushed voices, yet it is enough to provide the perfect cover. The nobles assume he is deaf to their words, blind to their gestures, his mind occupied solely with the mundane task of candle maintenance. And so they speak, unburdened by the presence of a living, breathing, and crucially listening human being. The snuffer's role demanded constant vigilance over the flames, but it also demanded a constant awareness of their surroundings. An eye for an unruly wick, an ear for a sudden draught, and inevitably a keen sense of what transpired in the dimly lit spaces they tended. They heard the subtle inflections of fear in a courtesan's voice, the forced joviality of a bankrupt lord, the barely contained fury of a spurned lover. They absorbed the nuances of conversation, the names whispered with disdain, the alliances forged with a conspiratorial glance. They heard the clink of coin changing hands under a table, masked by the rhythmic scrape of a snuffer's wax scraper against stone. These were not secrets sought out, but secrets stumbled upon, collected as inadvertently as soot on their tunic. The very act of bending low to extinguish a bedside candle placed the snuffer uncomfortably close to a nobleman's agitated murmurs, or a lady's tearful confessions to her maid. Their presence was a constant, almost ghostly reminder that even in the most private moments, one was never truly alone in a palace. For Thomas, these overheard fragments were often just background noise, another layer in the castle's nocturnal symphony. He had heard enough political machinations to understand their cyclical nature, enough illicit trysts to find them predictable, and enough financial woes to simply nod inwardly with a weary understanding. Most of the time, the information was incomplete, a snippet without context, like a single thread pulled from a vast, tangled tapestry. He rarely understood the full implications of what he overheard, and frankly, he rarely cared. His immediate concern was always the flame, its health, its longevity, its potential for harm. A flickering wick demanded far more of his attention than a whispered plot to undermine a duke. The very survival of the castle often hinged on the flame, not on the fate of any particular courtier. Yet, there were moments when the secrets he inadvertently gathered became too potent, too dangerous to simply ignore. The master of the royal flame, Alaric, a man whose weary eyes missed nothing, had a peculiar way of asking questions. He would never explicitly demand espionage. Instead, during their morning reports, as Thomas detailed the number of candles consumed in each wing, or reported on any unusual wax buildup, Alaric might casually interject, "And the Lady Eleonora's chambers, were they particularly bright last night, Thomas? Did she receive any unexpected visitors, perhaps?" Or when discussing the king's study, Alaric might muse, "Did you notice any unusual activity near the king's private documents? A misplaced quill, perhaps? A hurried departure?" These were not direct orders to spy, but subtle probes, tests of awareness, and a silent invitation to report anything that deviated from the mundane. Thomas understood that while his direct duty was to the flames, his ultimate loyalty was to the stability of the crown, and sometimes that meant discerning between an ordinary late-night visitor and one who arrived cloaked in conspiracy. The dilemma for a snuffer, then, was profound. To know too much was a perilous burden. A careless word, an accidental revelation, could mean not just dismissal but a lifetime in the dungeons, or worse. The royal court was a viper's nest, and a humble snuffer stumbling upon a viper's secret was as good as dead. Conversely, to actively suppress crucial information, especially if it related to a threat against the monarch, could also lead to severe punishment if later discovered. Most snuffers, therefore, cultivated an almost pathological disinterest in what they heard. an intentional blankness of expression that masked their true awareness. They developed a mental filter, allowing the mundane sounds of the court to pass through, while occasionally, almost unconsciously, retaining a detail that might be important to Alaric, or simply too unusual to discard. It was a subtle, dangerous game of perception and calculated ignorance. Thomas remembered one particular instance years ago, when he was still a journeyman. He had been extinguishing candles in a remote wing of the castle, in a small, rarely used antechamber. He found two high-ranking nobles, both members of the king's council, engaged in a heated argument. Their voices low, but sharp. One, Lord Fitzwilliam, was accusing the other, Lord Ashworth, of embezzlement, of siphoning funds intended for the royal guard. Thomas, performing his duty with exaggerated slowness on a candelabra nearby, heard every damning detail, the precise sums, the names of the co-conspirators, even the location of hidden ledgers. His heart pounded. This was not mere gossip. This was treason. He finished his rounds, his hands clammy, the familiar clicky of his snuffer sounding impossibly loud in his own ears. He spent the rest of the night in a cold sweat, wrestling with the knowledge. The next morning, at his report to Alaric, Thomas approached the subject with extreme caution. He began with the routine details of candle consumption in that particular wing. Then, with a carefully constructed nonchalance, he mentioned, "The candles in the small antechamber of the west wing, Master, they seemed to burn down unusually quickly last night, almost as if the air was quite warm with agitated voices, if you understand my meaning." He did not name names. He did not explicitly state the crime. He merely provided a vague observation about the conditions of the flame, leaving Alaric to infer the rest. Alaric's keen eyes, usually distant, sharpened. He simply grunted, then moved on to the next section of the castle. Within a week, Lord Ashworth was mysteriously absent from court, suffering, it was said, from a sudden grave illness that forced his retirement to a secluded country estate, never to be seen again. Thomas felt a chill down his spine. He had played the game, delivered the information, and survived. It was a silent, terrifying confirmation of his precarious position as an unwitting pawn in the shadowy world of court intrigue. This unspoken role as accidental informant added another layer of weariness to the Snuffer's already monotonous life. It meant that even in the quietest hours, their minds could never truly rest. They were forced to be observers, not just of flame, but of human frailty and ambition. They saw the true faces of the powerful, stripped bare by the dim, revealing light of the candle, or exposed by the panic of a sudden fire. They witnessed the hypocrisy, the fear, the desperation that lay beneath the glittering veneer of courtly life. Their very job, designed to bring controlled light to dark spaces, inadvertently illuminated the darkest corners of human nature. The collective knowledge of the Snuffer Corps, passed down in hushed tones between journeymen and apprentices, was a peculiar, unwritten chronicle of the castle's hidden history. Tales of secret passages known only to certain lovers, of hidden compartments in studies, of the precise route a particular spy would take on moonless nights. These were the true legends of the Snuffers. They knew where the light faltered, where the shadows stretched deepest, and where the human heart revealed its most vulnerable, or most dangerous, secrets. Their existence was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most mundane of professions held the most extraordinary and terrifying insights into the grand, often absurd, drama of power and human folly. They were the silent witnesses, the custodians of forgotten whispers, moving through the castle's unending nights, their snuffers clicking a quiet punctuation mark on the ceaseless narrative of royal intrigue. Chapter 8. The Curse of the Eternal Flame. Every profession, no matter how steeped in the mundane rhythms of daily toil, collects its own peculiar folklore, its whispered warnings, and its chilling legends. For the royal candle snuffers, whose days and nights were spent in intimate communion with the primal force of fire, These tales often took on an unsettling, even eerie quality. They spoke of flames that danced without a draught, wicks that refused to consume, and the dark omens gleaned from a sudden, inexplicable darkening of a room. Yet, amongst these countless cautionary whispers, one legend stood apart, recounted in hushed tones around flickering braziers on bitter winter nights. The tale of Cyprian and his futile struggle against a flame that simply refused to die. It was known simply as the curse of the eternal flame. Cyprian was not a man prone to fanciful notions. He was in fact remarkably pragmatic. A journeyman snuffer, known for his meticulousness, his unflappable calm even in the midst of a smoking inferno, and a constitution that seemed impervious to the gnawing fatigue that claimed lesser men. His hands were strong, his grip precise, and his brass snuffer, though not as ornate as Thomas, was always impeccably clean. He had served the crown for 15 years, extinguishing tens of thousands of flames, always with the same methodical grace, always with success. He believed in the tangible, wax, wick, oxygen, and the perfect decisive click of his tool. Spirits, curses, and omens were for the less enlightened, for those who didn't understand the simple physics of combustion. This unwavering practicality, however, would soon be his undoing, or at least the undoing of his peace of mind. The flame in question resided in one of the castle's most ancient and least visited sections, a small circular chamber deep within the forgotten catacombs, far beneath the royal chapel. It was not a grand hall, nor a place of power, but a crumbling, damp crypt, rumored to house the remains of a forgotten, perhaps even cursed saint. For centuries, a single, crude tallow candle had been left burning there, an ancient vigil, a testament to some long-lost penitence, or as some whispered, a containment spell. The duty of tending it, of ensuring it, didn't ignite the moldering tapestries or the dry bone dust, had always fallen to the snuffers. Cyprian himself had made the occasional visit, pinching the smoking wick, clearing the soot, and leaving it to burn for another day. It was just another candle, albeit in a particularly unpleasant location. But then, one unusually humid summer evening, Cyprian descended into the crypt for his routine rounds. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth and decay. The candle, as always, flickered weakly in its niche, casting grotesque shadows on the rough-hewn walls. He approached it, his hand outstretched, his snuffer poised. He pinched the wick. There was the usual sizzling, the brief expulsion of smoke, and then nothing. The flame momentarily dimmed, sputtered once, then, impossibly, rekindled itself. It glowed with a faint, malevolent orange, reforming its tiny spear of light as if mocking his very intention. Cyprian blinked. He tried again with more force, holding the snuffer closed for a longer count. Still, the flame, though momentarily smothered, would not die. It would flicker back to life, sometimes immediately, sometimes after a few heartbeats, a stubborn ember reigniting itself from the charred wick as if powered by an unseen force. He tried a third time, his brow furrowed in confusion. He even tried to pick off the entire wick with his fingers, burning them slightly in the process. But even then, the small pool of molten tallow in the candle holder would shimmer, and a new tiny flame would blossom, conjured from nothing but the waxy residue. It was as if the very idea of light, rather than any physical fuel, was animating it. This was unprecedented. Every flame, no matter how robust, required oxygen and a consistent fuel source. This one, by all logic, should have long since expired. Cyprian spent an hour down in that crypt trying every trick he knew. He tried pouring water on it. The water hissed and boiled, but the flame, though diminished for a moment, simply flared brighter once the water evaporated. He tried smothering it with sand. The sand would coat it, but a faint, unholy glow would persist beneath the grains, eventually re-emerging as a tiny, persistent tongue of fire. He even, in a moment of desperate frustration, considered picking up the entire candle and simply crushing it with a stone. But a strange, unsettling chill that seemed to emanate from the flame itself held his hand. He found himself unable to destroy it outright, as if an invisible force resisted his will. He ascended from the crypt that night, his mind reeling, his usual calm shattered. He left the accursed flame burning, a small, defiant beacon in the perpetual darkness. He reported the anomaly to Alaric, the master of the royal flame, who listened with a dismissive grunt, attributing it to an overly humid crypt and an old, poorly made candle. "Try again tomorrow, Cyprian," Alaric had said, waving a hand. "And don't be so foolish. A flame always dies." But it didn't. Cyprian returned, day after day, night after night. He brought new candles, replacing the old, but the new wicks, once lit from the original flame, would adopt its bizarre resilience. He tried dousing it with heavy cloths, depriving it of oxygen for minutes on end. But the moment the cloth was removed, the flame would, with an almost triumphant flicker, return. The flame became his tormentor, a mocking symbol of his professional inadequacy. His meticulousness, once his greatest asset, transformed into an obsessive, futile quest. He grew gaunt, his eyes rimmed with perpetual exhaustion, for the thought of that unkillable flame gnawed at him even in his restless sleep. He would dream of it, a tiny, defiant beacon, consuming his very sanity. Word of Cyprian's folly began to spread quietly through the ranks of the Snuffers. Initially, it was a source of amusement, a journeyman driven mad by an old candle. But as weeks turned into months, and the flame stubbornly persisted, the amusement curdled into a genuine sense of unease, then dread. Superstitions, once mere whispers, began to solidify. It was said that the flame was the very spirit of the forgotten saint refusing to rest. Others believed it was a curse placed upon the royal line, a slow, burning malediction that would eventually consume the entire castle. Still more pragmatic, though no less unnerved, believed it was a demon in disguise, a miniature inferno sent to test the Snuffer's faith and fortitude. The consequences for Cyprian, both real and perceived, were devastating. He became a pariah within his own guild. The apprentices who once looked up to his calm competence now avoided him, fearing that the curse of the unquenchable flame might rub off on them. Even the journeymen, his peers, kept a respectful, fearful distance, whispering about his deteriorating appearance and the unholy glow that seemed to follow him even in the daylight. Alaric, the master of the royal flame, while still outwardly dismissive, grew increasingly agitated. The existence of an eternal flame directly contradicted the fundamental principle of their profession, that all fire could be controlled, contained, and extinguished. It was an affront to his authority, a silent, burning challenge to the very essence of their guild. Alaric, in a desperate attempt to contain the growing unease and protect his reputation, eventually relieved Cyprian of all other duties. His sole task became the vigil over the eternal flame. He was to sit in that dank crypt, day and night, observing it, endlessly trying to extinguish it, and reporting any change, any flicker of weakness. It was a punishment disguised as a duty, a lifetime sentence to a personal hell. Cyprian, stripped of his normal rounds, his social contact reduced to the occasional, hurried delivery of food by a nervous apprentice, truly became a prisoner of the flame. His methods grew increasingly desperate, often bordering on the absurd. He tried depriving it of air by sealing the entire chamber for hours, only to find it burning merrily upon his return, as if breathing the very stone. He tried pouring consecrated water on it, reciting ancient prayers, all to no avail. He even tried singing to it, in a low, cracked voice, hoping to soothe whatever malicious entity possessed the flame. But it only seemed to flicker with renewed vigor. His meticulously cleaned snuffer, once a symbol of his mastery, became a useless appendage, a mockery of his former skill. It hung, unused, from his belt as he sat, hour after hour, watching the tiny, defiant glow. The flame, in its quiet, persistent defiance, began to symbolize something profound and unsettling to those who knew of it. It represented the limits of human control, the arbitrary nature of fate, and the terrifying possibility that even the most fundamental laws of nature could be inexplicably suspended. For the Snuffers, it was a constant burning reminder of the one thing they could not conquer, the one darkness they could not truly banish, because it was born of the very light they served. Cyprian, his once practical mind now unmoored from reality, began to converse with the flame, whispering entreaties, curses, and philosophical ponderings into the echoing silence of the crypt. He saw patterns in its flicker, messages in its smoke, and malice in its unwavering glow. He was no longer a snuffer of candles. He was the eternal warden of an unkillable light. Legend claims that Cyprian never left that crypt. He simply faded, becoming as much a part of the castle's eerie folklore as the flame itself. Some say his ghost still sits there, a gaunt figure forever staring at the tiny, eternal glow. Others claim that when the castle finally crumbled to ruin centuries later, the flame was the last thing to die, a small, persistent beacon, until the very last stone was rent asunder. For Thomas, and indeed for every snuffer who came after Cyprian, the tale served as a chilling reminder. No matter how skilled, no matter how vigilant, there are some flames, some mysteries that simply cannot be snuffed out. And the consequence of failing to extinguish even the smallest flame, especially one that insists on living, could be far more devastating than any accidental fire. It could be the complete and utter extinguishing of one's own peace of mind, leaving behind only the lingering smoky residue of madness. The curse of the eternal flame was not about a fire that wouldn't die, but about a spirit that couldn't rest, forever bound to an impossible task. It hung over their profession like the smell of old soot, a constant, low-burning fear in the back of every snuffer's mind, a reminder of the true fragility of their control over the elements. Chapter 9. The Snuffer's Secret Diary. It is a peculiar truth, often overlooked by the grand historians of ages past, that the most profound insights into the true nature of power, ambition, and human folly are rarely found in the meticulously inked decrees of kings or the bombastic pronouncements of courtiers. No, they are more often nestled within the quiet, unwritten chronicles of those who moved through the gilded cages of royalty as mere shadows, observing everything yet seen by no one. For a royal candle snuffer like Thomas, whose existence was defined by invisibility and the meticulous management of flickering light, a formal, leather-bound diary was an unthinkable luxury, an unimaginable risk. To commit such observations to parchment, to leave behind such a damning record of the court's true face, would be an act of suicidal recklessness. But a snuffer's mind, particularly one as perpetually alert and quietly cynical as Thomas, served as its own secret archive. An internal ledger of ironic observations, dry wit, and often a profound, weary understanding of the absurdities that unfolded beneath the constant glow of his carefully managed flames. This, then, is a peek into that unwritten diary, a collection of musings gleaned from countless nights spent in silent vigilance. Entry: on royal sleep patterns XT one would imagine, observing the sheer volume of beeswax consumed in the royal chambers each night, that the king and queen, along with their various offspring and favored relations, suffered from some rare form of nocturnal restlessness, a collective allergy to honest slumber. The king, for instance, frequently insists upon a minimum of 24 candles in his sleeping chamber, each placed precisely so as to illuminate his preferred reading spot, his various maps, and a rather disturbing portrait of his lineage that hangs opposite his bed. Yet, within moments of my final silent pass, to ensure all wicks are burning true. A soft snore robust enough to rattle the very sconces often reverberates through the thick oak door. The irony is not lost on me. A man who requires 1,000 points of light to feel safe in the darkness often plunges into profound unconsciousness with the swiftness of a stone dropped into a well, leaving me to extinguish the unnecessary brilliance lest the bed curtains catch fire from his restless flailing. Her Majesty, on the other hand, favors a more subtle approach, demanding only 3 candles, but each must be of the purest, dripless beeswax, and their flames must never, under any circumstance, flicker. She claims the flickering agitates her delicate humors. The truth, I suspect, is that she simply finds the gentle undulation of the light distracting from her incessant, low-voiced gossiping with her ladies-in-waiting, which often continues well past the 3rd hour after midnight. I have learned to distinguish the rustle of a silk gown from the shift of a body under a quilt, the latter signaling the opportune moment for my stealthy advance. Entry. On courtly grandeur and its flammability, the architects of this castle, bless their souls for their ambitious designs, clearly possessed a profound appreciation for timber and tapestries, and anything else, it would seem, that could ignite with the speed and ferocity of a dragon's breath. They build these magnificent halls, adorn them with acres of intricately woven wool and silk, then fill them with hundreds, nay, thousands of open flames, as if tempting the very spirits of combustion. The great hall, particularly during a royal feast, becomes a veritable tinderbox of opulence. The tables groan under the weight of roasted boar and shimmering silver, but my eyes are drawn, as always, to the 20-foot-tall candelabras, their arms stretching towards the ceiling like supplicating hands, each holding a dozen or more sputtering wicks, a single dropped ember, a forgotten snuff. And the entire spectacle, the king's very reputation, could be reduced to ash faster than a false promise. The courtiers, oblivious in their revelry, often sway dangerously close to the flames, their billowing sleeves a constant threat. I've witnessed more than one close call, a fleeting singed thread, a sudden waft of burnt wool, swiftly concealed by a nervous cough or a hurried pat. It is an exhausting dance, preventing the inevitable. And for what? So Lord Fitzwilliam can impress Lady Henrietta with his latest jewel, a trinket that glitters no brighter than a well-trimmed beeswax candle. Entry. On the perfume of the palatine, the air of the castle carries 1,000 scents, each telling its own tale. There is the persistent damp stone, the faint tang of rust from the armory, the rich, earthy smell of the kitchens. But for me, the most pervasive is the smell of candle. Not the sweet, pure scent of newly lit beeswax, no, but the complex, layered aroma of extinguished wick. It is the lingering ghost of 1,000 small deaths, a faint acridity mingled with residual sweetness, clinging to my tunic, my hair even, I suspect, my very soul. The common folk, if they ever caught a whiff of me, would likely think me a walking fire hazard, or perhaps just a particularly unwashed individual. But it is the scent of diligence, of prevention, of a job endlessly done. The nobles, in their chambers, demand scented oils for their lamps, essences of rose and lavender to mask the scent of stale air and unemptied chamber pots. They complain if a tallow candle in the corridor emits a whiff of animal fat. They fail to grasp that the very air they breathe, the very light they enjoy, is a product of my constant, malodorous efforts. I sometimes think of bottling the scent of a snuffed wick, marketing it as essence of vigilance, though I doubt it would fetch a price anywhere near a royal decree. Entry. On the illusions of privacy, they believe themselves unseen, unheard. The whispers of treason, the furtive embraces in shadowed alcoves, the desperate arguments over gambling debts. They conduct their illicit affairs under the very nose of the king, often in rooms I have just finished tending. I move through the darkness, my lantern a mere pinprick of light, yet I see all. The Lady Beatrice, a woman whose virtue is lauded throughout the court, has a lover who scales the north wall like a common thief, arriving precisely when the moon is new, and the candles in her antechamber are at their lowest ebb. I know this not because I spy, but because the peculiar scent of cheap liquor and foreign tobacco always lingers in her private parlor on those nights, mingling with the expensive beeswax. The Chancellor, a man of profound wisdom and gravitas in the daylight, paces his study at all hours, his words tumbling out in a torrent of anxiety, revealing his true fears about the king's health, or the precarious state of the treasury. He paces by the light of a single sputtering candle, completely unaware that I am but a shadow at the threshold, waiting for his pacing to cease, for his fears to subside, before I can finally put his room to bed. My presence is an inconvenient truth, a living reminder that the castle, for all its vastness, is a cage without true privacy. Entry, on the weight of responsibility, and Sooty Alaric, the master, speaks of the burden of his station, the weight of ensuring the castle's safety. He speaks of it as if it were some ethereal, crushing force. I, however, know the true weight of responsibility. It is the persistent ache in my lower back from bending over 1,000 low-set candles. It is the slight tremor in my hands after hours of precise trimming. It is the constant, almost physical presence of fear that hangs in the air, the fear of a single forgotten ember, a sudden draught, a moment of carelessness that could engulf the entire edifice. And then there is the soot. It is insidious, clinging to everything. It coats the inside of my nostrils, stains my fingertips a permanent gray, and leaves phantom smudges on my face even after a vigorous scrub. I imagine that when I finally cease this perpetual dance with light, I will simply dissolve into a fine black dust indistinguishable from the remnants of 1,000 snuffed wicks. Barnaby, poor Barnaby, is a constant living reminder of this weight. His crime was not malice, but simply a moment of human fallibility under immense pressure. He lives now in the cellar, amongst the damp turnips, extinguishing the cheapest tallow, his once sharp eyes now dull with endless regret. He thought he could outsmart a spark. He was wrong. The flame, it seems, always has the last laugh. Entry. On the absurdity of ritualing, the ceremonies of the court are a constant source of quiet amusement. The king must be dressed by 10 servants, though he possesses only 2 arms and 2 legs. The queen must be fanned by a page, even in the depths of winter. And then there are the candles. For a formal address, precisely 147 candles must be lit in the throne room, no more, no less. For a diplomatic reception, the number shifts to a precise 211, and they must all be beeswax, of course. My task is not merely to maintain them, but to ensure this absurd precision is upheld. If a candle burns down too quickly, I must quietly replace it, ensuring the magical precise number is maintained as if the very stability of the kingdom depends upon it. They speak of tradition, of grandeur, of the symbolism of light. I speak of wax consumption rates, of the efficiency of wicks, and the perennial problem of drafts from ill-fitting window frames. The symbolism for me is in the fact that no matter how grand the pronouncement, no matter how vital the treaty, it is all conducted by the light of a humble flame, a flame that requires a soot-stained hand to prevent it from consuming everything. They debate the fate of nations, while I debate the optimal angle for a wick trim. Who, I wonder, truly holds the key to the kingdom's continued existence? Entry. On the silent lifing, my life is one of perpetual silence, punctuated only by the soft G-click of my snuffer and the occasional hushed murmur of the sleeping castle. I am a ghost in residence, a moving shadow, a living secret. No one greets me, no one converses with me beyond a clipped instruction from Alaric. I have learned to find solace in this anonymity, a strange freedom in being utterly unregarded. I can observe, think, and exist without the tiresome demands of courtly etiquette or the exhausting dance of social expectation. My relationships are with the flames, their temperament, their needs, their inherent dangers. They are honest, unlike the courtiers. A flame, when it smokes, tells you it needs trimming. It doesn't pretend to be something it is not. The castle itself, in its vast echoing silence, has become my confidant. The stone walls hold centuries of whispers, of laughter and tears, of betrayal and triumph. And I, the humble Snuffer, add my own silent observations to its ancient memory, a fleeting, almost imperceptible smudge of truth on the grand tapestry of royal illusion. My legacy will not be found in any history book. But perhaps, if one were to sniff very closely at the ancient stones, one might still detect the faint, lingering scent of burnt wick, a testament to the quiet, ceaseless work of the unseen hands that kept the darkness and the fire at bay. Chapter 10. The Great Candle Shortage of 1683, the year 1683. For the grand chroniclers of the royal court might be remembered for a minor skirmish on a distant border, or perhaps a particularly bland diplomatic marriage. For those who dwelled in the dim, perpetually shadowed underbelly of the castle, for the silent brotherhood of the Snuffers, however, it would forever be etched into their collective memory as the year the light began to die. It was the year of the Great Candle Shortage, a period of profound, if absurd, chaos, when the very source of their existence, the wax that fueled the castle's glow, became a commodity more precious than gold. Forcing them to ration light and royalty to endure the humbling indignity of dimly lit dinners. The first whispers of trouble began not with a grand announcement, but with a subtle change in the weekly delivery from the royal chandler. Thomas, in his meticulous morning inventory, noted the boxes of beeswax candles were fewer, and the quality, even to his smoke-accustomed nose, seemed subtly off. Alaric, the master of the royal flame, usually a man of terse commands and grim efficiency, grew uncharacteristically agitated. His grunts became sharper, his eyes, already perpetually weary, seemed to sink deeper into their sockets. "The bee yields," he would mutter, running a hand over his balding pate, "are down, and the foreign suppliers demand triple the price, if they supply at all." A blight had fallen upon the hives, a harsh winter had claimed countless colonies, and distant wars had snarled the delicate threads of trade. The world, it seemed, conspired against the very notion of reliable illumination. Soon the whispers transformed into undeniable reality. The finest beeswax candles, once abundant enough to illuminate every hall and chamber, became a scarce luxury. The great hall, typically ablaze with hundreds of dazzling flames, began to host evenings lit by a mere fraction of its former glory. The candelabras, once groaning with beeswax, were now sparsely populated, their empty arms stretching into the gloom like skeletal fingers. Thomas found himself engaged in a new, profoundly unsettling task, not merely managing existing light, but rationing it. This was an inversion of his very purpose, a philosophical challenge to his life's work. His mission had always been to maintain the perfect flame, to ensure excess was contained and danger averted. Now, it was to make precious light last, to stretch every flicker to its absolute limit. His daily rounds, once a rhythmic dance of maintenance and precise extinguishment, became a painstaking exercise in strategic allocation. He would carry a small slate, scrolled with Alaric's precise, almost desperate instructions: King's Study, 3 beeswax, no more. Queen's Chambers, 2 beeswax, minimal tallow supplement. Great Hall, 5 candelabras only, to be extinguished by the 2nd hour after sunset. Outer corridors, tallow, 1 every 20 paces. The mere thought of a 100-foot stretch of stone corridor illuminated by a single sputtering tallow candle was enough to send a shiver down his spine. The castle, once a beacon of regal power, began to surrender to the encroaching darkness, becoming a place of long, whispering shadows and unexpected encounters. The greatest challenge, however, was not the cold logic of rationing, but the fiery indignation of the royal family. They, who had never known a moment of true darkness within their gilded cage, were affronted by the very notion of diminished light. "What is this gloom, Snuffer?" the king had roared one evening, squinting at his supper plate, barely able to discern the roasted capon from the accompanying turnip. "Am I to dine in the manner of a peasant by the light of a single smoking wick?" Thomas, who had just spent an hour coaxing a reluctant flame from a stubbornly short tallow candle, merely bowed deeply, offering no explanation, knowing any attempt at reason would be futile. The king was not interested in bee yields or trade routes. He was interested in his accustomed brilliance. The queen, perhaps more subtle, but no less demanding, would sigh dramatically, her voice laced with an almost theatrical despair. "My embroidery, Thomas. How can I mend the king's tunic when I can barely see the needle? The light is so meager," as if the universe itself had conspired against her needlework. The younger princes and princesses, accustomed to their chambers being ablaze with light for their endless games and studies, now whined incessantly about the shadows that danced mockingly in their rooms, making their elaborate playforts seem less grand, their storybooks harder to read. The royal physicians complained they could not properly examine patients in such poor light, threatening to misdiagnose common coughs as consumption. The entire court, it seemed, was thrown into a state of petty disarray, their grand affairs hindered by the most elemental of needs. Thomas, in his invisible rounds, heard it all. The muffled complaints, the exasperated sighs, the outright accusations that the Snuffers were somehow high-harding light for themselves. The irony was a bitter, smoky taste in his mouth. He, whose hands were permanently stained with the residue of extinguished flame, was now accused of depriving others of its warmth. His job, which had once been to prevent light from becoming a hazard, now became the painstaking, almost microscopic act of coaxing every last flicker from a dying ember. He became a magician of scarcity, transforming every fragment of wax into a precious resource. He found himself adopting new techniques, born of desperate necessity. Ricks were trimmed with an almost religious reverence, not just to remove carbon, but to preserve every millimeter of untouched wick. Candles were extinguished with an even greater meticulousness, ensuring not a drop of wax was wasted, carefully collecting the remaining stubs to be melted down and recast. An unpleasant, greasy task usually reserved for the lowliest apprentices. The pungent smell of tallow, once confined to the servants' quarters, now permeated even the royal chambers, clinging to tapestries and silken drapes, a constant, malodorous reminder of the kingdom's dimming fortunes. Thomas even began experimenting with old, discarded rushlights, crude affairs made of dried rushes dipped in animal fat, typically used by peasants. The results were smoky, unstable, and deeply unsatisfactory, but they were at least light. The great hall, during the evening meals, became a canvas for this new, unsettling reality. Where once polished silver and crystal had gleamed under 1,000 flames, now they merely reflected the anemic glow of a few dozen struggling candles. Faces once sharply defined were softened by shadow, making whispered conversations harder to discern, illicit glances harder to intercept. Court intrigue, usually conducted in the dazzling glare of public display, retreated further into the deeper shadows, becoming more furtive, more difficult for even the most observant Snuffer to follow. Thomas found himself more reliant on the nuances of body language, the shifting of a gaze, the sudden tensing of a shoulder, to glean meaning from the gloom. The entire court, stripped of its accustomed brilliance, seemed to shrink, physically and metaphorically. The apprentices, of course, bore the brunt of it. They were sent on increasingly difficult missions, scouring the deepest corners of the castle for forgotten candle stubs, begging scraps of wax from the kitchens, enduring the scathing rebukes of courtiers when they could not provide sufficient light. Barnaby, confined to the cellars, was ironically in his element. The dimness there was his constant companion, and the demand for quality light almost non-existent. He was tasked with the grim work of re-rendering old tallow, a truly unpleasant undertaking that suited his now bitter disposition. His colleagues, the senior Snuffers, found their already thankless job elevated to one of perpetual stress, their quiet discipline tested by the constant nagging anxiety of scarcity. Alaric, the master, became a haunted man. The burden of ultimate responsibility for the castle's illumination weighed heavily upon him. He rarely slept, often found pacing the storerooms, running his hands over the dwindling stacks of candles as if willing them to multiply. He would issue ever more stringent edicts, demanding that candles be extinguished the moment a room was vacated, that no flame burn unsupervised for a single moment, that every ounce of wax be accounted for. His face, already etched with the lines of worry, grew gaunter, his eyes shadowed with the constant dread of the next inevitable complaint from the royal family. He was a general in a war against darkness, fighting with ever-dwindling ammunition. The great candle shortage lasted for nearly 2 miserable years. 2 years of royal grumbling, of dim feasts, of shadows stretching across the grand halls like hungry beasts. 2 years of Snuffers, once masters of extinguishing, becoming tireless guardians of a fragile, precious glow. When, finally, the trade routes reopened, when the bee colonies began to recover, and new shipments of pure beeswax candles arrived at the castle gates, the relief was palpable, a collective sigh that swept through the entire household. The return of the light was met with a celebration usually reserved for military victories or royal births. But for Thomas, and for all the Snuffers, the experience left a permanent mark. The memory of the dimness, the pervasive smell of inferior tallow, and the constant gnawing anxiety of scarcity lingered like an unextinguished ember. It instilled in them an even deeper, almost philosophical understanding of light's true value, not as a given, but as a fragile, precious commodity. They had seen the true face of power in the gloom, stripped of its glittering illusions, reduced to querulous complaints about a mere lack of illumination. And they, the silent, invisible guardians of the flame, had been the ones to endure the real darkness, the true burden of keeping a kingdom from stumbling in the shadows. One carefully rationed, meticulously preserved flicker at a time. The great candle shortage of 1683, though barely a footnote in the grand histories, was, for the royal candle snuffers, a testament to the fact that even the most mundane of jobs could, when faced with an existential threat, become an epic struggle against the encroaching night. Chapter 11. The Snuffers' Rebellion. The great candle shortage of 1683, that period of unwelcome gloom and royal grumbling, had, in its own peculiar way, inadvertently sparked a flickering ember of discontent among the very individuals tasked with managing the castle's precious illumination. For years, the royal candle snuffers had toiled in obscurity, their vital work acknowledged only in its absence. Their existence as indistinct as the wisps of smoke they diligently banished. They were the silent, soot-stained backdrop to the vibrant, if often absurd, drama of courtly life. Their wages were meager, barely enough to keep a small family from the biting edge of hunger, and their living conditions were often as damp and unglamorous as the deepest cellars they frequented. Yet, for centuries, they had accepted this lot with the resigned patience of those who understood their place in the grand, immutable scheme of things. But the shortage had shifted something. It had, by forcing the king and his court to endure the discomfort of diminished light, unwittingly revealed the snuffers' indispensable nature. They had been seen, if only in the reflected absence of their diligent work, and that fleeting recognition, however grudging, had sown the seeds of an audacious, almost comical rebellion. The idea did not spring from a single fiery orator, for snuffers were by nature and profession men of few words and muted gestures. Instead, it brewed slowly, like thick tallow rendering in a cold pot. A silent collective frustration passed between the journeymen during their hurried pre-dawn exchanges, and whispered in the damp, quiet confines of their shared sleeping quarters. Thomas, the senior snuffer, found himself increasingly sought out, not for guidance on a problematic wick, but for sympathetic grunts regarding the rising price of bread, or the persistent cough of a child worsened by the draughty, unheated rooms they called home. The younger apprentices, still raw from their early burns and eager for any relief from their endless monotonous scrubbing of wax, were particularly vocal, though their complaints were often dismissed as youthful impatience. But even old Cyprian, confined to his eternal vigil over the unquenchable crypt flame, had managed to convey his grievances through bitter, muttered prophecies to the apprentice who brought him his meager meals. The collective spirit, though quiet, was building. The spark that finally ignited this slow-burning discontent was not a single dramatic event, but a series of petty indignities. A new royal decree, issued by the Lord Chamberlain, seemingly to cut costs, reduced their already paltry daily bread ration by a third. Then came the announcement that the quality of their uniform smocks would be downgraded, from coarse, durable canvas to flimsy, quick-to-tear linen, despite the constant exposure to wax and soot. And finally, the master of the royal flame, Alaric, a man usually impervious to the tribulations of his charges, received word that the king, weary of the complaints during the recent shortage, had allocated a considerable sum for the procurement of new ornamental candelabras for the great hall, while simultaneously denying Alaric's repeated requests for a slight increase in the snuffer's weekly wages. It was the ultimate irony. Money for more candle holders, but not for the hands that kept them from burning the castle down. This was too much. The clandestine meeting took place in the deepest, most forgotten cellar beneath the oldest part of the castle, a space usually reserved for discarded furniture and the occasional terrified rat. The air was cool, damp, and smelled of earth and neglect. Perhaps 24 snuffers, from the most junior apprentice to the most grizzled journeyman, gathered by the dim, flickering light of a single tallow candle, its flame meticulously trimmed, of course. No senior snuffer, save Thomas, was present, for their position often meant a greater fear of reprisals. The meeting was awkward at first, filled with shuffling feet and averted gazes. Snuffers were accustomed to silence, not deliberation. But Thomas, with a weary sigh that carried the weight of years, finally broke the quiet. "Brothers," he began, his voice surprisingly firm in the echoing space, "we are the invisible hands that keep this castle from darkness and from ruin. They see only the light, never the effort. They enjoy the warmth, but forget the sweat. They complain of a single smoking wick, but rarely commend the thousands that burn true. Now they would starve us, clothe us in rags, and expect us to do our duty with empty bellies and blistered hands, all while buying new baubles for their grand halls." A low murmur, a collective grumble, rippled through the small assembly. Thomas continued, "We, who prevent the castle's destruction, are treated as less than the very wicks we tend. This cannot stand. We must demand what is fair." The discussion was slow, hesitant, but fueled by a shared sense of grievance. They spoke of the cold, the fatigue, the burns, the ceaseless hours, the inherent dangers of their calling. They were not asking for riches or titles, but simply for recognition of their worth in the only language the court understood. Their demands were simple: a modest increase in their daily wage, an allowance for better, thicker smocks, and a guarantee of adequate, wholesome food rations. It was decided after much quiet debate and the occasional, surprisingly passionate outburst from a normally stoic journeyman, that Thomas, as the most respected senior snuffer, along with a younger, more articulate journeyman named Elias, would present their grievances, not directly to the king, for such a direct approach would be met with immediate dismissal, but to Alaric, the master of the royal flame, the man who for all his sternness understood their plight more than anyone. The next morning, Alaric sat at his heavy oak desk in his Spartan office, reviewing the latest wax consumption reports, his brow furrowed in concentration. The door creaked open, and Thomas and Elias entered, their faces grim, their posture unusually rigid. Alaric looked up, his weary eyes narrowing. "Something amiss with the beeswax, Thomas? Another batch of faulty wicks?" he asked, his voice laced with his usual dry impatience. Thomas stepped forward, holding a crumpled piece of parchment, the list of their demands, hastily scrawled by Elias. "Master Alaric," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "we, the royal candle snuffers, have a petition." Alaric's face remained impassive for a moment, then a flicker of bewildered annoyance crossed his features. "A petition? What nonsense is this? Your duty is to the flame, not to parchment." Elias surprisingly found his voice. "Master, we work day and night. We prevent disaster. We are the castle's unseen protectors. Yet our families starve while the court feasts. We ask for fair compensation for our ceaseless vigilance." He then, with a surprising degree of eloquence, laid out their demands: a penny a day more for each journeyman, a halfpenny for apprentices, and 2 extra portions of stew for their daily meals, plus new, heavy canvas smocks twice a year. Alaric listened in silence, his expression a mixture of disbelief and growing consternation. The idea of hissing snuffers, the most unobtrusive and compliant of all castle servants, daring to yet petition was utterly unprecedented. It was like a shadow demanding to be seen, a whisper demanding to be heard. He knew their grievances were legitimate, but the sheer audacity of the act, the very concept of EA collective demands, was an affront to the established order. He ran a hand over his face. "You understand, do you not, the gravity of this? To present such a request to the crown? This is not done." "Master," Thomas interjected, his voice low but firm, "the alternative is worse. The men are restless. If their demands are not heard, then perhaps the castle will find itself in quite a bit more darkness than usual." The implication hung in the air, thick and acrid as a poorly snuffed wick. It was an unspoken threat, a quiet declaration of potential withdrawal of their labor, a strike of silence and gloom. The castle, by morning, would be plunged into an unprecedented, terrifying darkness. Alaric stared at them, his eyes wide with a sudden, dawning comprehension of the chaos this could unleash. A dark castle was an insecure castle. A dark castle invited whispers of instability, fear, and even rebellion. The thought of thousands of unsnuffed smoke-belching candles, or worse, of no candles at all, sending the entire court into a panicked frenzy, was a nightmare scenario. He sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to drain the very air from the room. "Leave the parchment," he said, his voice clipped. "I will present this folly to the Lord Chamberlain. But I warn you, if this backfires, your livelihoods, and indeed your very freedom, will be forfeit." The Lord Chamberlain, a portly man of self-importance and limited imagination, was, predictably, furious. "A rebellion of snuffers? What is this madness, Alaric? Do these candle tenders truly believe they hold power over the king? Let them strike. Let them grovel in the dark. We shall simply light the candles ourselves." Alaric, however, was a pragmatist. "My lord, with all due respect, there are thousands of candles in this castle. Thousands. It takes a trained hand, a lifetime of practice to manage them, to prevent them from igniting curtains or precious documents, or indeed the royal bed itself. A single misplaced ember from an untrained hand, and the king's very palace could be reduced to ashes in a single night. Do you recall Barnaby, my lord? The great crimson curtain of the great hall? The chamberlain blanched at the mention of Barnaby, the shame of that infamous incident still a raw wound. He imagined the king stumbling in the dark, stubbing his royal toe, or worse, the castle burning. The logistics of a widespread, court-wide lighting effort were indeed impossible. He conceded, grumbling. The king, when the matter was finally presented to him by a very nervous Lord Chamberlain, was utterly baffled. Snuffers? What are snuffers? Do we truly employ such people? And they wish for more stew? More comfortable smocks? What absurdities are these? He had never given a single thought to the maintenance of the castle's light, assuming it simply was. The idea of these invisible entities having grievances, having commands, was completely beyond his comprehension. He peered at the chamberlain. Are they not grateful for the privilege of serving the crown? A penny more, you say? Half a penny? His voice was a mixture of outrage and genuine perplexity. Your Majesty, the chamberlain stammered, they are indispensable, and the master of the royal flame assures me that without them the potential for, shall we say, unfortunate incidents would increase dramatically. The king pondered this for a long moment, stroking his beard. The idea of his castle burning down was certainly undesirable. The thought of having to light his own bedchamber candle was utterly repulsive. And these demands, though bizarre, seemed small in the grand scheme of his kingdom. He waved a dismissive hand. Very well. Give them their wretched penny and the stew. But tell them if I hear another word of petitions, they shall find themselves tending flames in the deepest dungeon, by the light of their own tears. And so, the Snuffer's rebellion ended not with a bang, but with a grudging, almost imperceptible whisper of success. It was not a grand victory. No royal decrees were issued praising their courage. No statues erected in their honor. Their wages were increased, minimally, and their smocks, though still coarse, were indeed of a slightly better quality. The stew, they noted with grim humor, seemed to have slightly more sustenance. For the Snuffers it was a profound, if quiet, triumph. They had, for the first time in their thankless history, made themselves seen, made their vital role undeniable. Thomas, observing the subtly improved morale among his colleagues, the slightly less strained expressions on their faces, felt a rare flicker of satisfaction. They remained the silent shadows, the unseen guardians, but now they were shadows with a touch more dignity, a touch more warmth in their bellies, and a quiet, shared understanding that even in the deepest darkness, a small, persistent flame of collective will could indeed, if managed with enough patience and threat, bend the ear of a king. The castle continued to burn brightly, but now it did so on slightly more expensive, and far more begrudgingly, acknowledged terms. It was a victory of the mundane, a rebellion of the invisible, proving that even the most overlooked hands held a silent power over the light that governed a kingdom. Chapter 12. The ghost of the overzealous snuffer in the quiet annals of the royal candle snuffers. A profession defined by precision and the careful removal of light, there existed a tale whispered in hushed tones, a chilling testament to the dangers of taking one's duty too seriously. It was the legend of Silas, a journeyman snuffer whose dedication to extinguishing became so absolute, so unyielding, that it transcended the boundaries of mere diligence and veered terrifyingly into the realm of the fanatical. His story was a particularly dark and ironically humorous addition to the collective folklore, reminding every snuffer that while vigilance was paramount, a certain degree of common sense, and indeed a humble awareness of tradition, was equally essential. For Silas, the ideal castle was one where no unnecessary flame, no matter how symbolic or ancient, was permitted to exist. His was a purity of purpose, a singular vision of absolute fire-preventing darkness. Silas had always been an oddity, even among a guild composed largely of quiet, introspective men. He was thin, almost reedy, with eyes that held an unnerving intensity, perpetually fixed on the dance of flame and smoke. While other apprentices chafed at the ceaseless rounds and the mundane nature of their tasks, Silas embraced it with an almost religious fervor. He meticulously cleaned his snuffer, polishing the brass until it gleamed like a golden eye. He could discern the precise moment a wick would mushroom from 20 paces, and his pinch was famously swift, leaving no lingering wisp of smoke, no stray ember. His journeyman years were marked by an impeccable record of fire prevention. No flame under his purview ever strayed. No candle ever caused even the slightest singe. His efficiency was, in a way, terrifying. He saw fire not as a tool, but as a beast barely contained, constantly seeking release, and his job, his sacred duty, was to hold it ever in check, to eliminate its very potential for chaos. He was obsessed with the absence of light, for in absolute darkness there could be no fire. This zeal, initially praised as exemplary diligence by Master Alaric himself, began subtly to curdle into something unsettling. Silas would extinguish candles the moment a courtier left a room, even if they were merely stepping out for a moment, leaving returning nobles fumbling in unexpected gloom. He would snuff out lamps in the guard posts, even if a sentry was still reading dispatches, arguing that the sun was now up, and therefore artificial light was an unnecessary hazard. He took the maxim of fire prevention to its literal, absurd extreme, becoming a harbinger of sudden, inconvenient darkness. His fellow snuffers found him increasingly difficult to work alongside, his silent, judgmental presence making them feel as if their own perfectly acceptable diligence was somehow lacking. He saw their occasional moments of leniency, allowing a candle to burn a little longer for convenience, as acts of dangerous negligence. His quiet disapproval was a heavier weight than any verbal rebuke. The object of Silas's ultimate misguided zeal was not a common beeswax candle or a sputtering tallow lamp. It was the eternal torch, a flame of profound historical and symbolic significance, burning perpetually within the castle's oldest, most sacred crypt. This was not a candle, but a robust ancient torch, its wick a thick, slow-burning braid of hemp, fueled by a special, purified oil that was replenished hourly by a rotating cadre of specially assigned apprentices. The torch had burned continuously for 5 centuries, a constant beacon of the kingdom's enduring spirit, its unbroken lineage, and the unwavering favor of the heavens. Legend had it that if the eternal torch were ever to be extinguished, the kingdom would fall, the royal line would wither, and a blight would descend upon the land. It was the one flame, the Yonley flame, that was never, under any circumstances, to be snuffed. It was, in fact, the living antithesis of a snuffer's purpose, yet its existence was an absolute, unchallengeable given. Even Alaric, the pragmatic master of the royal flame, would treat the eternal torch with a reverence bordering on superstition, ensuring its constant vigil with an almost obsessive care. One moonless night, Silas found himself on a rare, unsupervised patrol deep within the castle's most ancient and forgotten wing. He had been assigned to extinguish a troublesome series of damp, moldering rushlights in the abandoned servants' passages, a task so far beneath his perceived skill that it felt like a punishment. His meticulous nature, however, meant he scoured every dark corner. He descended deeper than usual, following a draft that suggested a forgotten passage. The air grew colder, heavier, filled with the scent of ancient stone and something else, something subtly rich and oily. He stumbled into a chamber unlike any other he had ever seen, the crypt of the founding kings. And there, in the very center of the crumbling stone floor, stood the eternal torch. Its flame, robust and golden, cast long, dancing shadows of forgotten monarchs across the vaulted ceiling. It was magnificent, certainly, a spectacle of ancient fire. But to Silas, his mind honed to a singular purpose, It was simply a flame. An uncontrolled, unsupervised flame, burning in an uninhabited chamber, its wick unusually long and smoking with a telltale plume of carbon. It was, to his hyper-vigilant mind, an inexcusable fire hazard, a blatant defiance of all the principles he held sacred. The very thought that this fire was meant to burn eternally, without intervention, without his discerning eye to perfect its burn. Vas anathema. It was an anomaly, an affront to the natural order of controlled light, and his professional duty. He approached it slowly, his brass snuffer, his most cherished tool, clutched in his hand. He noted the thick, carbonized mushroom at the wick's tip, the heavy smoke that drifted upwards to blacken the ancient ceiling. This was a poorly maintained flame, a glaring example of neglect, despite its grand title. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from the righteous indignation of a craftsman encountering shoddy work. He ignored the profound silence of the crypt, the chilling sense of history, the very idea of a centuries-old vigil. He saw only a problem and a solution. He raised his snuffer. The ancient torch, as if sensing its impending doom, seemed to waver, its flame momentarily dimming, then flaring with a sudden, desperate intensity. Silas held his breath, his eyes narrowed in a fierce concentration. He pinched. The yoy-clicky of the brass jaws, usually so crisp and efficient, seemed to echo with a strange, unnatural resonance in the crypt. The flame, stubborn and tenacious, fought him. It recoiled, sputtering, struggling against the deprivation of oxygen. Silas held the snuffer closed, pressing harder for a full, agonizing minute, longer than he had ever held it on any other flame. A faint hissy permeated the air, a final, despairing gasp. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible jiba-paw, the flame died. Absolute, impenetrable darkness descended upon the crypt. The black was not merely the absence of light, it felt like a physical presence, a crushing, suffocating blanket that pressed down from all sides. The scent of ancient stone and decay, now unmasked by the warmth of the flame, became overwhelming. Silas stood in the profound void, his snuffer still clutched open in his hand, a strange sense of quiet satisfaction blooming in his chest. He had done it. He had extinguished the unruly, dangerous flame. The castle, by his hand, was now utterly safe, rid of its most persistent and problematic fire hazard. He emerged from the crypt hours later, his face streaked with soot, his eyes wide with a triumphant, unhinged glint. He reported to the night watchman, his voice oddly detached. All flames extinguished, even the one in the ancient crypt. No more hazards. The watchman, a burly man more accustomed to counting sheep than candles, merely grunted, too tired to fully comprehend the enormity of Silas's declaration. The true chaos, however, began at dawn. The master of the royal flame, Alaric, entered his office only to be met by a terrified apprentice, stammering about the sudden complete darkness within the crypt of the founding kings. Alaric, his heart sinking with a terrible dread, rushed down to the crypt, carrying a dozen lit candles. He found it in absolute blackness, the eternal torch a cold, dead stump. His face, usually grim, turned ashen. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone what this meant. Panic, slower to build than a fire, but far more pervasive, began to seep through the castle. The king, awakened by the unusual chill that had settled over the entire edifice and the sudden unsettling silence of the usually bustling castle, demanded to know why his morning fire was not lit. His advisers, hearing of the extinguished torch, turned pale. The legend of the kingdom's doom, once a fanciful tale, now loomed like a spectral hand. Messengers were dispatched. Frantic attempts were made to relight the torch, but no amount of flint and steel, no new oil, no amount of prayer or ritual could coax a flame back to life from its ancient wick. The crypt remained in perpetual symbolic darkness. The kingdom, it was whispered, was cursed. Silas, when finally apprehended, stood before the king, his face serene, unrepentant. "It was a hazard, your majesty," he stated, his voice flat, his logic unassailable to his own mind. "The wick was long. It smoked. I extinguished it." The king, usually prone to furious outbursts, merely stared at Silas, a profound, uncomprehending despair in his eyes. To extinguish the very symbol of his reign, out of pure literal-minded duty. It was an absurdity, beyond all punishment. How do you punish a man for doing his job too well? The royal court was in an uproar. The Lord Chamberlain advocated for immediate execution, if only to appease the gods and lift the supposed curse. The royal confessor suggested perpetual penance. But the king, strangely, did nothing. Silas was not executed. He was not even banished. He simply vanished. One morning, his small room in the service corridors was empty. His brass snuffer, meticulously cleaned, hung on its hook, but Silas was gone, leaving no trace but the lingering smell of beeswax and a profound, unsettling silence. And then the legend began. They said that Silas, the overzealous snuffer, was condemned to a purgatory of perpetual extinguishing. His ghost, they whispered, still roams the castle's darkest corners, forever searching for a flicker of light to snuff out. Guards on lonely night watches reported sudden, inexplicable draughts that extinguished their lanterns, or a cold touch on their arm, followed by the eerie sensation of their very breath being drawn away, leaving them in sudden, suffocating dark. Servants, hurrying through the torchlit passages, would sometimes hear a faint, almost imperceptible clicking, and then find their torch sputtered out, leaving them disoriented in the pitch black. Children were warned not to leave any candle burning unattended, lest Silas's ghost find it, and plunge their dreams into perpetual darkness. His story became a cautionary tale for all snuffers. Never extinguish what truly matters, even if it defies your training. The master Alaric, haunted by the memory of the eternal torch and Silas's unwavering conviction, ensured that a new rule, unwritten but absolute, was etched into the mind of every apprentice. A flame exists not just as fire, but as meaning. And sometimes, the most dangerous act is not to let a flame burn, but to put it out. The crypt of the founding kings remains in perpetual darkness to this day, a chilling monument to the snuffer who took his job too seriously, and in doing so, plunged a kingdom into both symbolic and profound, unsettling night. Silas, the ghost of the overzealous snuffer, forever searches for the last spark, forever consumed by the urge to bring forth absolute darkness. Chapter 13. The rise and fall of the candle, snuffer dynasty for generations uncounted, stretching back through the dimming centuries, the meticulous art of candle snuffing within the sprawling, labyrinthine confines of the royal castle had been the singular preserve of a family known only as the Grimshaws. Their name, rough and unadorned, was rarely uttered in the gilded halls above, but in the damp, echoing passages beneath. It was synonymous with unwavering vigilance and a quiet, almost spectral mastery over the flickering edge of illumination. It was said that the Grimshaws were born with soot under their fingernails and a preternatural calm in the face of spitting flame. Their eyes, accustomed to the perpetual twilight of the castle service corridors, could discern a poorly spun wick from 50 paces, and their hands possessed an almost surgical precision, capable of pinching a glowing carbon mushroom from a flame without disturbing a single particle of dust on the surrounding candelabra. The dynasty, if one could call such an unsung lineage a dynasty, had not begun with a grand pronouncement or a royal favor. No, it had simply grown, organically, from the sheer necessity of a persistent, dangerous task. The first Grimshaw, a man named Aelred, was said to have been a simple serf, pressed into service after a minor kitchen fire had nearly claimed a section of the royal scullery. His quick thinking, his surprising knack for controlling errant flames, and his remarkable tolerance for the endless repetition of extinguishing and trimming had set him apart. He had passed his skills to his son, and that son to his own, each generation adding a layer of accumulated wisdom. A nuanced understanding of wax temperament, wick composition, and the subtle, telltale whispers of a flame about to misbehave. They knew the precise location of every sconce, every candelabra, every hidden niche within the castle walls, and more importantly, the precise temperamenti of each flame within them. The great hall's massive chandelier, for instance, had a persistent draught that required an extra long wick on its eastern side. The king's private study, conversely, always received a batch of candles with wicks that burned too quickly, necessitating more frequent trims. These were the Grimshaw secrets, passed down in murmured tones during silent, shared meals in their Spartan quarters, or during pre-dawn rounds. Their rise to preeminence was not marked by overt displays of power, for the Grimshaws eschewed such fleeting vanities. Instead, it was an insidious, almost imperceptible infiltration of indispensability. When a particularly careless courtier once knocked over a lit candle near a stack of dry parchment in the royal library, it was a Grimshaw, a man named Gareth, who appeared as if from nowhere, extinguishing the burgeoning blaze with a deft swipe of his thick, fire-resistant gauntlet, before vanishing back into the shadows. When a particularly humid summer caused unprecedented sweating of the beeswax, threatening to deform thousands of expensive candles, it was a Grimshaw, the cunning old Mordred, who devised a system of ventilation and careful rotation that saved the royal coffers from ruin. They were never publicly lauded, never given titles beyond Snuffer or Master Snuffer, but their quiet, consistent competence cemented their position. When a new master of the royal flame was appointed, he always looked to the Grimshaws for guidance, for they were the true, living memory of the castle's fire management. They were the immovable, invaluable fixtures of the castle's nocturnal existence, a constant flickering counterpoint to the fleeting reigns of kings. Their tools, too, became part of the family legacy. The Grimshaws possessed a set of snuffers crafted from a unique dark steel, passed down through the generations. Each snuffer has subtly different balance, a distinct feel in the hand, and each was etched with the initials of every Grimshaw who had wielded it. Thomas, our familiar snuffer, often spoke with quiet reverence of the Grimshaw lineage, acknowledging their unparalleled skill, their unyielding dedication. The master, Alaric himself, for all his weary pragmatism, held a grudging respect for their unbroken tradition, for he knew that the castle's continued safety rested, in no small part, on the shoulders of this one peculiar family. They were the silent, unacknowledged custodians of the royal light, their legacy etched not in stone but in the very absence of fire. And then there was Ilara. Ilara Grimshaw was the latest, and as fate would have it, the last, in this long line of dedicated snuffers. He was a young man of 23, and if the family line continued for 100 more generations, there might not have been a more gifted practitioner of the craft. His movements were fluid, almost preternatural. He could trim a wick from 3 paces with a throw of his specialized lighter snuffer, a technique that left lesser snuffers agape with envy. His senses were razor-sharp. He could smell the faint, almost imperceptible scent of an over-burning wick long before any visible smoke appeared. His devotion to the art of extinguishing was absolute, a profound, almost spiritual commitment to the elimination of fire hazards. He believed, with the unshakable conviction of youth and unparalleled skill, that Yale flames, save for the practical necessity of a hearth, were inherently dangerous, and his duty was to bring them to their perfect, safe conclusion. He dismissed the ancient legends, the subtle superstitions, and the courtly traditions as quaint foolishness, distractions from the fundamental purpose of his calling. The ghost of the overzealous Snuffer Silas was a cautionary tale for most. But for Ilara, it was a tale of a man who simply had not been high thorough enough, not absolute enough, in his pursuit of ultimate safety. The king, a man of profound anxieties and superstitious inclinations, had recently welcomed his firstborn son. A frail but precious infant, Prince Alaric, named in a rare moment of deference to the steady master of the royal flame. The birth, following years of barrenness and whispered concerns about the succession, had been met with a fervent, almost hysterical joy throughout the kingdom. To celebrate this momentous occasion, and to bless the newborn prince with a long, prosperous life, the royal astrologer, a wizened, star-gazing man of ancient traditions, had decreed a special ritual. In the nursery, a chamber rarely visited by anyone outside the queen and her closest confidantes, a single consecrated beeswax candle was lit. Its wick, made from the hair of a blessed lamb and dipped in holy oil. This was the fortune's flame, meant to burn continuously, without interruption, for precisely 100 days and 100 nights, symbolizing the unbroken flow of life and prosperity into the new era. Its extinguishment, before the allotted time, would invite ill fortune, sickness, or even the dreaded withering of the royal line. It was the only flame in the entire castle that was expressly forbidden to be snuffed, trimmed, or even touched by mortal hands, save for the daily addition of a small, precisely measured drop of blessed oil. Ilara heard the whispered instructions, of course. He heard the Lord Chamberlain's solemn pronouncements, the Master Alaric's grave, almost fearful reiteration of the rules. But Ilara, with his unwavering focus on the reality of fire, saw only a problem. A single candle, left to burn for 100 days without trimming? The wick would lengthen, carbon would build, it would smoke excessively, coating the delicate tapestries in the nursery with soot, irritating the tender lungs of the newborn prince, and most egregious of all, it would become a profound fire hazard. A single glowing snuff falling onto the embroidered cradle linen. The thought sent a jolt of ice through his veins. Tradition, superstition, royal decree, all of it seemed secondary to the very real, very tangible threat of fire. His job, his inherited duty, was to prevent such catastrophes. On the 98th night of the Fortune's Flame, Ilara was on his routine rounds of the private royal chambers. The castle was quiet, cloaked in the deep hush of true midnight. He moved like a breath, a shadow among shadows, his senses attuned to the subtle shifts in air current, the minute variations in the sound of the stone. He approached the nursery, the special guards having been discreetly dismissed by the queen for a rare moment of private meditation with her newborn. Ilara paused at the door, listening. No sound. He pushed the heavy oak door open a bare crack, slipping through like mist. The nursery was bathed in the soft golden glow of the Fortune's Flame. It sat on a small, ornate table beside the princeling's cradle, its flame tall, almost unnaturally so, and its wick, after 98 days of uninterrupted burning, was indeed a grotesque, blackened mushroom of carbon. A thin, almost imperceptible wisp of smoke curled upwards, drifting towards the delicate lace-trimmed curtains of the cradle. To Ilara's hyper-trained eye, it was an abomination, an impending disaster, a symbol of professional negligence that screamed for his intervention. The historical significance, the astrologer's dire warnings, the queen's sacred belief, all of it faded before the stark, unyielding logic of fire prevention. This was a flame that needed tending. He approached the small table with his finest, most precise brass snuffer, the one his grandfather had passed down to his father, and his father to him. He noted the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in his hand, a flicker of something that might have been hesitation, or perhaps just the lingering after-effects of a particularly long shift. But he dismissed it. Duty called. He positioned the snuffer, aligning its cup perfectly beneath the offending wick. He squeezed. The eye-clicky was soft, decisive, and horribly final. The tall golden flame of the fortune's flame, the symbol of a kingdom's hope and a royal lineage's future, sputtered, recoiled. And then, with a pathetic, almost human sigh, it died. The glowing snuff, larger than any he had ever extinguished, fell cleanly into the cup, cooling to harmless ash. Absolute darkness descended upon the nursery, a cold, suffocating black that swallowed the very air. The scent of burnt wick, acrid and sharp, permeated the chamber. Elara stood for a moment in the sudden void, his snuffer still open in his hand, a profound, almost serene sense of accomplishment filling him. He had done it. He had removed the hazard. The nursery was now safe. He had prevented what he genuinely believed would have been a catastrophic fire. He slipped out of the nursery as silently as he had entered, unaware that the queen, who had been meditating in a chair by the unlit hearth, had been jolted awake by the sudden, absolute darkness and the faint, acrid smell of extinguished flame. She cried out, a small, choked gasp of horror. The discovery, by the royal wet nurse moments later, of the cold, dead stump of the fortune's flame sent a shockwave through the castle. The queen was inconsolable, collapsing in tears, screaming that the prince was cursed, that her lineage was doomed. The king, upon hearing the news, rushed to the nursery, his face ashen, his usual bluster replaced by a profound, superstitious terror. The astrologer, summoned in haste, wrung his hands, murmuring dire prophecies of blight and withering. The palace erupted into a panic far deeper, far more chilling than any mere fire. This was not a physical threat, but a spiritual one, an existential crisis for the very legitimacy of the throne. When Elara, utterly bewildered by the unfolding chaos, confessed his actions expecting commendation for his vigilance, the king stared at him with a look of utter, soul-crushing despair. He did not scream. He did not rage. He merely looked at Elara, the man who had, in his literal-minded duty, extinguished the very light of his kingdom's future. "You," the king said, his voice barely a whisper, "you have snuffed out not a flame, but a dynasty. Our dynasty." The punishment was swift, and for the Grimshaws far worse than any execution. The king, advised by a terrified Lord Chamberlain, who feared the spread of the curse to the entire royal household, issued a decree that echoed through the castle halls like a death knell. The Grimshaw family, root and branch, was stripped of all their privileges, their quarters, and their meager allowances. They were banished from the castle walls, forbidden to ever set foot within its precincts again. Their centuries-old position as the royal candle snuffers was dissolved, irrevocably. No Grimshaw, it was declared, would ever again be permitted to touch a flame within the royal household. Their treasured inherited snuffers were confiscated, melted down into common metal, erasing every trace of their lineage from the very tools that had defined them. The Grimshaws left the castle as they had arrived, quietly, unceremoniously, but this time in utter disgrace. Elara, his face streaked not with soot but with the bitter tears of incomprehension, could not grasp the magnitude of his crime. He had only done his duty, prevented a hazard. Yet his family, the silent guardians of light, were now cast out into the enduring darkness of the outside world. Their purpose, their identity, extinguished as thoroughly as the fortune's flame. The position of royal candle snuffer did not vanish entirely. Of course, it was too vital a role. But never again would it be held by a single family. Instead, it became a rotating duty, filled by a succession of nervous, less experienced individuals, each terrified of making a mistake, each acutely aware of the Grimshaw curse. The castle, though still lit by countless candles, now carried a subtle, almost imperceptible dimness, a shadow that seemed to cling to its ancient stones. The memory of the fortune's flame, its short, vibrant life, and its sudden, tragic end, became a chilling cautionary tale, whispered not just by the astrologers, but by the new generation of snuffers. And for the snuffers who came after, the story of Elara Grimshaw was a stark, ironic reminder that sometimes the most dangerous act was not to allow a flame to burn, but to extinguish the one flame that, by its very existence, held the precarious hope of a kingdom. The Grimshaw dynasty, the silent guardians who had kept the castle from burning for centuries, ultimately fell not to fire, but to a single misguided clique, proving that sometimes even the most profound dedication, when devoid of context and reverence, can cast the longest, most tragic shadow. Chapter 14. The Snuffer's Final Bow, the Relentless March of Time. That invisible, irresistible force that reshapes kingdoms and relegates grand empires to the dusty pages of forgotten histories, often manifests its most profound changes not with the thunder of cannons or the clash of crowns, but with the quiet hum of a new invention for the royal candle snuffers, whose lives were meticulously woven into the flickering tapestry of wax and wick. This inexorable progress arrived not as a sudden cataclysm, but as a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the quality of the light itself. It began not with a grand announcement, but with a whisper, then a faint hiss, and finally a steady, unblinking glow that heralded the end of an ancient, unglamorous, yet utterly vital profession. This was the twilight of the candle, and the final, melancholic bow of the snuffer. The first hint of this impending obsolescence arrived, as all true disruptions do, quietly. Whispers began to circulate among the castle's engineers and more scientifically inclined courtiers of a miraculous new form of illumination, a light that burned without a wick, without wax, and most disturbingly for the snuffers, without a single troublesome ember to be tended. It was called gaslight, a strange ethereal glow fed by invisible pipes and ignited by a mere turn of a tap. For Thomas, and indeed for most of his colleagues, it seemed like a fanciful tale, a piece of parlor trickery for the benefit of the overly imaginative. How could light exist without a flame consuming something tangible, without the comforting if dangerous dance of fire and wax? It defied the very logic of their existence. Alaric, the master of the royal flame, dismissed it with a characteristic grunt, declaring it an impractical novelty, prone to explosive temperaments and an unseemly odor. He, like many traditionalists, clung to the familiar, if flawed, reliability of the candle. Yet, the novelty began its insidious creep. Initially, a single, experimental gas lamp was installed not in a grand hall, but in the deepest, most utilitarian bowels of the castle, the great kitchen. Its constant, bright glare, unwavering and unblinking, immediately rendered the scores of smoky tallow lamps redundant. The cooks, initially wary, quickly embraced its unwavering convenience, no longer having to squint through sooty air or worry about a flaming wick catching a chef's hat. Then another appeared in the main laundry, banishing the perpetual damp gloom that had long plagued the washerwomen. The light was clean, bright, and most crucially, it did not smoke, it did not drip, and it did not, to the endless frustration of the snuffers, require trimming. The sheer relentless practicality of it began to chip away at the fortress of tradition. The impact on the snuffers' routines was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, then accelerating with a chilling inevitability. Thomas would arrive for his pre-dawn rounds to find whole sections of the castle, once dotted with hundreds of dying flames, now bathed in the steady, almost clinical brilliance of gaslight. The endless corridors, once a tapestry of shadows and flickering glows, became brightly, uniformly illuminated, stripping them of their ancient mystery. His heavy bucket for collecting candle stubs grew lighter, his rounds shorter, and the rhythmic clicking of his snuffer, once the defining sound of his nocturnal ballet, became a rarer, almost mournful punctuation mark in the expanding silence. Sections of the castle that had once required dozens of candles now needed none. The great hall, eventually fitted with a majestic central gas chandelier, its 100 burners spewing forth a blinding torrent of light, now needed only a handful of supplementary beeswax candles for pure ceremony, and even those were soon deemed unnecessary. The snuffers, those silent guardians of the flame, found themselves adrift in a sea of encroaching light. Their specialized skills, honed over lifetimes, became increasingly irrelevant. How does one trim a gas jet? How does one extinguish a light that has no wick, no wax, no physical flame to pinch? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, unsettling. The apprentices, once eager to learn the nuances of the brass snuffer, now gazed with longing at the castle's new gas fitters, grubby men who worked with pipes and wrenches, but whose trade seemed to promise a future. Elias, the younger journeyman who had spoken so eloquently during the Snuffer's rebellion, found himself with fewer and fewer candles to tend, his once busy hands often idle, twisting his now immaculate unsoiled snuffer uselessly between his fingers. Even old Barnaby, still confined to the cellars, found his meager tallow candles replaced by a single harsh gas lamp, condemning him to a new form of dark idleness, his penance strangely diminished by the lack of actual flames to tend. For Thomas, the change was a profound existential shift. His life had been defined by the flame, its needs, its dangers, its meticulous management. He understood candles. He understood the delicate balance of light and shadow, the subtle art of coaxing a reluctant wick, the satisfying sizzle of a flame brought to its necessary end. Gaslight offered no such intimacy. It was cold, impersonal, a constant, unblinking eye that required no interaction, no vigilance, no human hand to guide its temperamental nature. It was light without soul, illumination without effort. He walked the increasingly bright corridors, his polished brass snuffer hanging uselessly at his belt, feeling like a ghost haunting a future that had no place for him. His senses, once so acutely tuned to the subtleties of flame, now found nothing to interpret. The pervasive smell of beeswax and spent wick, the very perfume of his profession, slowly faded from the castle air, replaced by the faint, sometimes metallic, scent of manufactured gas. Alaric, the master of the royal flame, suffered perhaps the most acutely. His entire career had been built on the premise of controlling the unpredictable nature of fire. He had overseen thousands of candles, battled countless near blazes, and wrestled with the stubborn reality of human fallibility. Now his department, once a vital, if unglamorous, pillar of castle operations, was shrinking before his very eyes. His ledgers, once filled with precise calculations of wax consumption, lay largely blank. His meetings with the Lord Chamberlain, once about crucial allocations, now concerned only the slow dismantling of his once proud corps. His authority, once absolute within his realm, was rendered meaningless by a technology that bypassed the very need for his expertise. He saw his snuffers, once diligent and indispensable, now idly polishing their tools, their hands itching for a wick to trim, a flame to manage. The irony was exquisite. He had spent his life preventing fires, and now the very absence of fire, the very perfection of this new light, was snuffing out his purpose. He became more taciturn than ever, his sighs heavier, his eyes holding a profound, melancholic resignation. The king and the court, however, embraced the new light with unreserved enthusiasm. No more soot-stained tapestries, no more wax-dripped floors, no more worries about a misplaced ember sparking a terrifying blaze. Dinners were uniformly bright, council meetings clear, and the royal chambers glowed with an unprecedented, constant brilliance. The complaints about dimness, once so frequent, vanished entirely. The expense of the initial installation was quickly offset by the elimination of countless candles and, more significantly, the reduction in the wages of the now redundant snuffers. The pragmatic benefits of gaslight were undeniable, eclipsing any sentimental attachment to the old, flickering ways. The inevitable arrived with the turn of the new century. The royal candle snuffer as a distinct profession ceased to exist. Their skills, once so vital, so precisely honed, became utterly obsolete. The last generation of snuffers, men like Thomas and Elias, were gradually phased out. Some were retrained, awkwardly, into the burgeoning ranks of gas fitters. Learning to mend pipes rather than trim wicks, their nimble fingers now grappling with heavy wrenches instead of delicate snuffers. Others, too old or too set in their ways, were given meager pensions and sent to live out their remaining years outside the castle walls, their lives of quiet vigilance replaced by enforced idleness. Their unique knowledge, the unwritten chronicle of wax and wick, of draughts and dangers, of royal eccentricities and courtly whispers, faded with them. The subtle superstitions, the shared lore of a flame that would not die, the warnings of the overzealous snuffer, all became quaint anecdotes, charming remnants of a bygone era, understood only by those who remembered a world lit by the precarious dance of fire. The castle, once a living entity breathing light and shadow, became in its new uniform brilliance somewhat colder, more sterile. The dramatic chiaroscuro that had once painted grand scenes on its ancient walls was gone, replaced by a flat, unwavering illumination. The subtle scents of beeswax and spent wick, the comforting aromas of a managed fire, were replaced by the clean, odorless efficiency of the new era. The quiet eye-clicky of the snuffer, once a constant, almost comforting presence, was replaced by the silent hum of progress, a sound that held no memory, no history, no human touch. And so the royal candle snuffer, that peculiar, indispensable, and utterly unglamorous figure, quietly faded into the annals of history. Their final bow was not on a grand stage, under the glare of 1,000 candles, but in the quiet, unassuming shadows of a castle, transitioning into a new age. They left behind no grand monuments, no heroic tales of battle, but their legacy was undeniably profound. For centuries they had quite literally kept the lights on, allowing kings to rule, courtiers to scheme, and poets to dream, all under the vigilant, soot-stained eye of the humble, forgotten snuffer. They were the men who brought the darkness under control, allowing civilization to flicker brightly, until, ironically, light itself rendered them obsolete. Their story is a quiet testament to the fleeting nature of human endeavor, the endless march of invention, and the countless mundane hands that in their own small, unassuming ways truly built the world, one carefully tended or carefully extinguished flame at a time. The castle now stands, bathed in its modern glow, a stark reminder that even the most vital, most constant elements of our world can vanish, leaving behind only the faintest, lingering scent of burnt wick in the long, echoing corridors of time.